The Stagecoach Robbery, Pearl Hart and the Failure of Punishment. Written by Alana Sanchez, narrated by Vivienne. Copyright 2026 Alana Sanchez. All rights reserved. No part of this book may be reproduced, edited, copied, altered, printed, shared, unauthorized storage on electronic devices, or distributed without the written permission of the author. Preface. When the system cannot finish the sentence. Pearl Hart did not commit a crime that should have troubled the justice system. There was no mystery, no uncertainty about what had occurred. A stagecoach carrying United States mail was stopped on a public road. A firearm was produced. Money was taken. The offenders were identified, pursued, arrested, tried, convicted, and sentenced under federal law. Everything functioned as designed. And yet, the case did not resolve. This book begins not with the robbery itself, but with that failure of resolution, because Pearl Hart's significance lies less in the act she committed than in what followed after the state had already spoken with authority. The late 19th century American justice system was not subtle about punishment. It relied on visibility, endurance, and hierarchy. It expected the convicted body to be broken down into routine and silence. Especially on the frontier, punishment was meant to reassure the public that order was firm, masculine, and unyielding. Hart's conviction satisfied those expectations on paper. She was found guilty of a serious federal offense. She was sent to one of the most severe prisons in the territory. The law had no difficulty naming what she was, a criminal. The difficulty arose when the system had to keep her. Pearl Hart was not spared because she was innocent. She was not spared because the law was misapplied. She was not spared because her crime could be reinterpreted as something smaller or less serious. She was spared because punishment itself became the problem. Her presence inside the prison exposed contradictions the system had not resolved. A woman convicted of a violent, public crime did not fit cleanly into the categories punishment depended on. She could not be made invisible without explanation. She could not be absorbed without adjustment. She could not be held without generating questions the institution did not want to answer. The system had the power to punish her. It did not have the cultural confidence to sustain that punishment. That distinction matters. This book is not interested in rehabilitating Pearl Hart's reputation, nor in condemning her beyond what the record supports. It does not treat her as a folk hero, a feminist symbol, or a curiosity of frontier life. It does not speculate about motives the archive cannot prove. It does not romanticize the violence of the robbery or the conditions that produced it. Instead, it treats Hart as an institutional case study. What happens when the justice system encounters an offender who cannot be cleanly punished without undermining its own authority? What happens when imprisonment creates more disruption than release? What does the system do when the sentence is lawful, but its continuation becomes narratively unstable? These are not questions about Hart alone. They are questions about punishment as a social practice. Women who committed crimes in the 19th century were often absorbed into familiar explanations. They were framed as mad, coerced, fallen, or pathological. These frames allowed the system to contain them without confronting the implications of female agency. Pearl Hart resisted those explanations by the simple fact of remaining legible. She was competent. She was articulate. She did not disappear into illness or remorse. The system could punish her, but it could not translate her punishment into a story that reassured the public about order. This is where institutions falter, not when they lack power, but when power cannot be made to mean the right thing. Like the trunk murders, this book is written with restraint. It relies on court records, prison documentation, and contemporary reporting. It avoids sensational reconstruction and moral certainty where the record does not support it. The narrator does not intrude to rescue or condemn. The institutions are allowed to speak through their actions. What emerges is not a legend of outlawry, but a quieter, more revealing story, one in which the system enforces the law correctly and still retreats. Hart's early release was not a moral awakening. It was not forgiveness. It was not justice completed. It was the system choosing to stop before it had to explain itself any further. Pearl Hart's case sits at the intersection of crime and credibility. It shows how punishment depends not only on legality, but on cultural tolerance. It shows how gender can destabilize authority not through protest, but through presence. It shows how institutions manage embarrassment by reframing retreat as discretion. Most of all, It shows that justice does not fail only when it is unjust. It can fail when it is too correct to be sustained. This book follows that failure carefully, not to expose hypocrisy, but to understand the machinery that produces it. Because sometimes the most revealing moment in a criminal case is not the crime, not the verdict, and not even the sentence, but the moment the system quietly decides it cannot bear to finish what it started. Chapter 1. The Road to Globe. The desert does not hide the way cities do. It offers distance, not cover. A person can travel for miles and still be visible as a moving against scrub and rock. Roads are narrow. Water is scarce. Towns are strung like beads, each one dependent on the next and suspicious of strangers passing through. In the late 1890s, Arizona Territory was still being narrated to itself. Newspapers and politicians spoke the language of progress: rails, mines, postal routes, order. The frontier was advertised as hard but governable, a place where the federal government could extend its hand through mail and law. This is why the stagecoach mattered. A stagecoach was not only transport. It was a moving institution, a link between towns, a carrier of money, messages, and authority. When it arrived, it brought more than passengers. It brought proof that the territory belonged to a wider system. To rob a stagecoach was to interrupt more than travel. It was to challenge a promise. And to do it in 1899 was to do it in an era when the state wanted the frontier myth to begin closing. Outlawry was meant to be an old story. Order was meant to be the new one. Hart stepped into that transition and committed a crime the territory claimed it had outgrown. Hart did not emerge from nowhere. People rarely do. But the record offers her in fragments, and the fragments must be handled carefully. The temptation, especially in stories about women, is to fill gaps with moral language. She was fallen, reckless, hard, romantic, ruined. These words do not clarify. They decorate. What can be said without decoration is that she lived a life shaped by movement and precariousness, crossing borders between Canada and the United States, between respectability and survival, between dependency and self-direction. She did not belong securely to a household or a stable trade. She belonged to the in-between spaces where many women lived and many institutions refused to look directly. Her name at birth was Pearl Taylor, and she was born in Canada, likely Ontario, around 1871. She married young. The marriage did not hold. After that, she traveled, worked where she could, and learned what thousands of women in her position learned: that independence was possible, but it was not protected. It was a tightrope. In the American Southwest, the tightrope ran through saloons, boarding houses, mining towns, and the informal economies that clustered around them. Women were judged constantly and helped rarely. A woman could be described as respectable or ruined on the strength of a rumor. A man could be described as unfortunate and still be allowed dignity. This imbalance shaped everything, including crime. Men robbed with swagger and were folded into the frontier myth. Women who broke the law were not folded in as easily. Their crimes threatened not only property, but the story society told about what women were supposed to be. Hart entered Arizona carrying that threat without needing to announce it. The stagecoach route near Globe mattered because Globe was not a romantic frontier outpost. It was a functioning center of mining money and territorial administration. The mail route connected it to broader commerce. The coach carried passengers, parcels, and often cash. It represented routine. Routine is what criminals watch. A successful robbery depends less on bravado than on predictability. When the coach leaves, what road it takes, where it slows, where it must stop, how quickly a posse can be raised, which towns will cooperate, which will hesitate. The frontier may look lawless from a distance, but it was structured by timetables and habits. Hart and her companion, Joe Boot, chose their moment in May 1899. Boot was a man with a record and a familiarity with the hard edges of territorial life. Hart's partnership with him has been interpreted in every available way: seduction, coercion, romance, desperation. The record does not need romance to explain it. Partnership in marginal life is often transactional. Two people combine resources because neither can survive well alone. What matters is that the two of them decided to take from the system directly, not by petty theft, not by confidence tricks, but by stopping a coach and demanding money. It was an act designed to be public. Accounts of the robbery later emphasized one detail more than any other: Hart's clothing. She wore men's clothing during the holdup. This detail has been repeated so often that it risks becoming costume rather than fact. But its significance at the time was real. Clothing was treated as a marker of category. A woman in men's clothes was not simply dressed differently, she was stepping across a social boundary and claiming a freedom usually reserved for men: movement, anonymity, and authority. Men's clothing also served practical purposes. It could obscure identity, reduce immediate suspicion, allow freer riding and walking, and permit the offender to be read as male at a distance. But in the courtroom and the press, practicality mattered less than symbolism. Hart was not just a robber. She was a woman behaving like a man. That framing intensified everything that followed. It turned a straightforward robbery into a cultural event. The press did not merely report her crime, it reported her as a contradiction. A male robber could be read as a familiar figure in a fading myth. A female robber was read as an anomaly that demanded explanation. Explanations are where institutions begin to distort. The robbery itself was not grand. It was not a polished operation. It did not yield a fortune. It was, by most accounts, awkward and limited. That is one of the story's quiet ironies. The act was small in its financial outcome and immense in its symbolic impact. Stagecoach robberies were already becoming less common as rail networks tightened and law enforcement grew more coordinated. The era of dramatic highwaymen was being replaced by paperwork and patrol. Hart and Boot did not steal enough to disappear into a new life. They did not vanish into the mountains. They did not become enduring outlaws in the practical sense. They became a case. And a case is something the system can handle. After the robbery, pursuit followed quickly. The frontier was not empty. People traveled. News moved. Roads were watched. A stagecoach robbery did not simply injure a victim, it interrupted commerce. When commerce is interrupted, communities cooperate with enforcement in ways they may not cooperate over private violence. Hart and Boot were captured not long after the offense. This capture is important because it strips the story of one familiar outlaw ingredient: the long manhunt. There was no extended duel between robber and law. The system did what it was designed to do: locate, arrest, process. From that point, Hart entered the machinery. The machinery moved her from the road into a cell, from a public act into a legal file. The file began to accumulate: names, dates, charges, testimony. Her body became evidence of category: female, dressed as male, publicly transgressive. Her speech became evidence of character. Her past became material to be interpreted. All the raw ingredients were there for the state to do what it preferred: convert a disruptive act into a cautionary tale. The crucial institutional detail is that this was not treated purely as local robbery. Because the coach carried mail, the offense implicated federal authority. The case became, in effect, a question of whether the United States government could protect its routes and punish those who challenged them. That question carried weight in Arizona territory, where federal legitimacy mattered. Territories were watched. They were judged as ready or unready for statehood, governable or unruly. Criminal cases could become political proof. A woman robbing a male coach at gunpoint was not only a crime against individuals. It was an embarrassment. The system would not tolerate embarrassment for long. Hart's trial and sentencing were not simply about the money taken. They were about reinforcing the story that order was firm and expanding. She had stepped onto a road that belonged, symbolically, to the state. She had stopped its coach. She had demanded payment as though authority could be taken by force. Now the state would demand payment in return. Hart would later speak in her own defense, and she would later be described in ways that slid between fascination and contempt. Some would treat her as a romantic outlaw. Others would treat her as a moral warning. The truth is less theatrical and more instructive. She was a woman who made herself visible in a place where women were expected to survive quietly. She committed a crime that demanded public acknowledgement. In doing so, she forced institutions to respond not only to the offense but to the disruption of category she represented. The robbery, in the end, was only the opening act. The story that matters, the one that reveals the limits of punishment, begins when the road ends and the courtroom begins. Chapter 2, Sentence. The conviction settled the legal question. It did not settle the institutional one. Pearl Hart was found guilty of mail robbery under federal law, a charge that carried weight far beyond the small amount of money taken. Because the stagecoach carried U.S. mail, the offense was not treated as frontier mischief or local banditry. It was a crime against the federal system itself. That distinction mattered. It removed the case from local discretion and placed it within a machinery designed to assert national authority. The sentence followed accordingly. Hart was sent to Yuma Territorial Prison, a facility intended to be definitive. Yuma was not built for rehabilitation or moral reflection. It was built to endure heat, isolation, and monotony, to demonstrate that the state could outlast the individual body placed inside it. Punishment there was not symbolic. It was physical and relentless. For male prisoners, that logic was familiar. For a woman, it created a problem the system had not fully anticipated. Hart entered Yuma as a convicted criminal, not a curiosity. The law made no allowance for her gender at the point of sentencing. On paper, she was simply an offender. In practice, her presence unsettled the institution from the moment it had to decide where to put her, how to house her, how to explain her continued visibility. Prisons depend on disappearance. They work best when the punished body is removed from public view and absorbed into routine. Hart resisted that absorption without doing anything dramatic. She did not riot. She did not escape. She did not recant or perform penitence. She remained legible, articulate, watched, talked about. The system had punished her correctly. The system did not know how to live with that punishment. Her imprisonment exposed contradictions the court had no reason to consider. Yuma was designed as a male space, physically and symbolically. The presence of a woman required adjustments that made the punishment visible again, separate arrangements, special scrutiny, constant explanation. Each adjustment weakened the illusion that imprisonment was neutral and universal. Punishment became conspicuous. At the same time, Hart did not cooperate with the expected moral narrative. She did not collapse into shame. She did not present as broken. She did not allow the prison to convert her into an example that justified its own severity. This mattered more than is often acknowledged. Prisons do not only confine bodies, they produce meaning. They rely on the idea that punishment reforms, deters, or at least humbles. When an offender remains symbolically intact, the punishment begins to look excessive rather than corrective. The problem was not that Hart was suffering too little. The problem was that the suffering could not be made to signify properly. Official explanations later gestured toward practical concerns, health, propriety, administrative difficulty. These explanations were not false. They were also incomplete. What they masked was a deeper discomfort. The system could not reconcile its authority with the optics of maintaining her confinement. Keeping her began to cost more than releasing her. Not financially. Narratively. An offender who will not disappear becomes a liability. A punishment that draws attention to itself begins to look unstable. Institutions prefer quiet endings. They prefer outcomes that do not invite further explanation. Hart's continued presence demanded explanation. So the system chose the least disruptive exit available to it. What followed was not reform, repentance, or resolution. It was an awkward institutional cough, and an early release. Chapter 3: The Court That Needed a Story. A courtroom is not built to hold the frontier as it actually was. It is built to translate the frontier into categories the state can manage. By the time Pearl Hart reached trial, the robbery itself had already begun to change shape. On the road it had been a brief interruption, a gun, a demand, a handful of money and valuables, and then flight that lasted only as long as the territory allowed. In the newspapers it was becoming something else, a symbol. In the court it would become a case, and cases require narrative discipline. A stagecoach robbery can be prosecuted on facts alone: the taking, the threat, the weapon, the identity of the accused, the presence of mail. But courts rarely operate on facts alone. They operate on persuasion, and persuasion depends on story. The state needed a story that would do two things at once: prove the elements of the offense beyond reasonable doubt, restore the impression of order after a public challenge to authority. Hart's presence made the second task difficult, because she was not simply an accused robber. She was a category problem. A man with a gun fits easily into a familiar criminal archetype. A woman with a gun does not. The system must explain her before it can safely punish her. In the late 19th century, women defendants were rarely treated as neutral legal subjects. They were read through social expectations: chastity, dependence, softness, shame. A woman's alleged crime was weighed alongside a judgment of her femininity. If she appeared too hard, she was treated as monstrous. If she appeared too emotional, she was treated as unstable. If she appeared too competent, she was treated as deceptive. The law claimed universality. The courtroom performed difference. Pearl Hart had already violated one of the most visible markers of gender distinction. She had worn men's clothing during the robbery. The practical significance of that choice was limited. The cultural significance was immense. It told the public that she did not merely commit a crime, she crossed a boundary. When the state brings a defendant into court, it is not only prosecuting the offense. It is prosecuting the threat the defendant represents to the social order. For Hart, that threat was simple and intolerable. She demonstrated that a woman could commit a public, armed robbery and remain recognizably herself. She did not arrive as a silent, ashamed figure. She arrived as a person with a face, a voice, and a story of her own. Courts are uneasy with defendants who insist on being narrators. The legal setting mattered. Because the stage carried mail, the case fell under federal jurisdiction. This placed Hart in a courtroom where the offense could be treated not as petty frontier theft, but as an attack on a federal function. It also meant the stakes were larger than the money taken. The mail system was a symbol of national coherence. In a territory still being judged by its governability, an interruption to the mail route could be read as a humiliation. The state could not allow humiliation to stand. A mail robber might have been punished as part of a familiar pattern, men taking risks, men being put down. A female robber risked becoming an advertisement for disorder. If the state punished her lightly, it could look weak. If it punished her harshly, it risked public discomfort at seeing a woman crushed by the full machinery of punishment. This was the bind. The court needed a story strong enough to justify severity without appearing cruel. That is the kind of story institutions work hardest to produce. Pearl Hart did not make that work easier. She offered her own explanation, and whether one reads it as truth, strategy, or a mixture of both, it reveals the shape of the defense available to a woman at the end of the 19th century. She framed her actions in terms of desperation and abandonment. She did not present herself as a professional criminal. She did not present herself as a hardened outlaw. She presented herself as someone pushed into unlawful action by circumstance. This was not merely personal storytelling. It was a legal tactic aligned with cultural expectations. A woman defendant could rarely rely on a defense built on cold calculation or ideological defiance. Such stances tended to backfire. The available sympathetic frame was victimhood. But Hart's use of that frame was complicated by the fact that her crime had been so public and so assertive. She had stepped into a traditionally male form of criminal theater, the hold-up. The gun disrupted the helpless woman narrative. The clothing did too. Thus, even as she spoke in the language society could understand, need, betrayal, survival, her actions contradicted the softness the language implied. This contradiction is one reason Hart remains compelling. She cannot be easily reduced to either archetype. She is not only a victim. She is not only a villain. She is an offender who understood the available scripts and still refused to disappear inside them. The prosecution did not need to work hard to establish the act. The facts were comparatively clean. Hart and Boot had been caught shortly after the robbery. Witness accounts and the recovery of stolen property or proceeds could be marshaled. The Stagecoach's male status provided the federal hook. What the prosecution did need was moral architecture. It needed to convince jurors not only that Hart had committed the offense, but that punishing her harshly was necessary and proper. It needed to avoid allowing her gender to pull the jury toward mercy. It needed to prevent the case from becoming a referendum on the system's cruelty. This is where the courtroom's cultural work becomes visible. The prosecution could emphasize certain themes: the threat to travelers, the threat to the male, the need for deterrence, the danger of armed offenders, the idea that the frontier must be tamed. Within this frame, Hart's gender could be made to work against her. She could be presented as doubly dangerous, dangerous because she had a gun, and dangerous because she had stepped outside her proper place. A woman who commits a masculine crime can be portrayed as abnormal, and abnormality justifies exceptional punishment. This is one of the dark mechanics of gender in the courtroom. The same society that expects women to be weak can punish a strong woman as though her strength were evidence of moral deformity. If the defense sought sympathy, the prosecution sought containment. Containment is what courts do best. They contain the offender in a legal category, and they contain the public in a reassurance narrative. The system works, the threat is identified, order will be restored. In Hart's case, the reassurance narrative was especially important because of the timing. By 1899, the stagecoach robbery was already becoming an anachronism. Railroads and telegraph lines were tightening the territory's integration into national systems. Arizona's political future depended on demonstrating order. A hold-up on a mail route was therefore not only a crime. It was a challenge to the state's claim that it was progressing beyond frontier disorder. It had to be answered decisively. The jury convicted. This fact is often reported with a tone of inevitability, as though there had been no room for doubt. But a conviction is never merely mechanical. It is a decision made by people in a cultural context. The conviction meant the jury accepted the prosecution's narrative of necessary deterrence and accepted that Hart, despite being a woman, deserved the full weight of federal punishment. This was not a minor outcome. It represented a kind of institutional triumph. The system succeeded in treating Hart not as a woman to be protected, but as an offender to be made an example of. The example would be made at Yuma. And yet, the conviction did not resolve the story, because the courtroom was only the first institution to encounter Hart as a category problem. The court could pronounce sentence. The prison would have to live with it. That difference matters. The courtroom ends with a verdict because its function is to decide. The prison does not decide. It manages. And in the management of Pearl Hart, the system would discover a limit it could not address by rhetoric or procedure. The punishment it had imposed was lawful, but sustaining it would expose the institution's own contradictions. The story turns there, away from the court's certainty and into the prison's discomfort. Because a verdict can be announced in minutes. A sentence must be carried in years. And years are where institutions reveal what they can tolerate. Chapter 4, Yuma Territorial Prison. The sentence looked clean on paper. In practice, it was a relocation into heat. Yuma Territorial Prison was not a figure of speech in the late 19th century. It was an argument made of stone, iron, and climate, an assertion that the state could punish through endurance. The prison sat beside the Colorado River in a landscape that did not soften. Summer temperatures were not merely uncomfortable, they were oppressive, sustained, and punishing in themselves. Even when the prison was not actively trying to harm, the environment did the work. This is how Yuma was supposed to function. The territory's harshness turned into moral instruction. For most prisoners, the institution could rely on a familiar rhythm. Men arrived, were processed, assigned, watched, worked, and folded into routine. The prison consumed individuality through schedule and scarcity. The object was not merely to confine bodies, but to produce submission by repetition. Pearl Hart's arrival disrupted that rhythm before she had done anything at all. The prison was built as a male institution. That fact was not incidental. It shaped everything: architecture, staffing, procedures, assumptions about risk, assumptions about control. In a male prison, the system can treat people as interchangeable units of discipline. With a woman inside, interchangeability breaks. The institution must begin explaining itself. Every special arrangement announces that the system is not neutral. The prison's first problem: where to put her. Prisons depend on placement. Placement is not only logistical, it is symbolic. Who is housed with whom, who is separated, who is watched, who is permitted to disappear into the mass. These choices create the prison's internal logic. A woman could not be placed casually inside Yuma's existing structure. Housing her required separation, which required attention, which required policy, which required staff to think about her rather than merely manage her. Prisons dislike being made to think. It is not that prison officials were incapable. It is that the institution functions best when it can reduce human complexity to rules. A woman in a male prison is human complexity that cannot be reduced without risk. The risk is not only violence or escape. It is scandal. Scandal is one of the strongest forces in institutional decision-making. It hovers over every interaction and turns ordinary administrative choices into reputational threats. A male prisoner's suffering is expected. A woman's suffering can become a story. Hart did not need to speak for this to be true. Her gender made her visible, and visibility is an enemy of carceral routine. The second problem: the meaning of her punishment. Punishment has to mean something publicly. A sentence is not only about the offender, it is also an instruction to the community. this is what happens when you challenge authority. In a frontier mythology, punishment is blunt and masculine. The offender is subdued. Order returns. The state appears firm. Pearl Hart complicated that display. A woman convicted of armed robbery could not be easily folded into familiar moral lessons. If she was punished harshly, the system risked looking cruel. If she was punished gently, the system risked looking weak. The prison was tasked with carrying out the sentence without creating a second controversy. This was already a contradiction. The court had treated her as an offender, full stop. The prison had to treat her as an offender and a problem of optics at the same time. The prison could not admit optics mattered. It could only behave as though they did. Routine as a weapon, and as a weakness. Prison routine is usually described as security. It is also a weapon. It teaches the prisoner that the institution controls time, waking, eating, moving, working, sleeping. The prisoner's body becomes an object moved through the day by others' decisions. For most prisoners, routine creates invisibility. Once you are part of the schedule, you stop being a story. You become a number and a task. Hart's presence interfered with invisibility. She could not be allowed to become just another body in the yard. Separation and supervision kept her distinct. Distinction kept her interesting. Interest kept her dangerous to the institution's desire for quiet. A prison can tolerate violence more easily than it can tolerate attention. Attention invites questions, inspections, headlines, visitors, moralizing outsiders. Attention threatens the institution's claim that it is merely carrying out law, not improvising around it. Hart's existence inside Yuma created attention simply by being unusual. Even if she had behaved with perfect compliance, the institution still had to solve the problem of her meaning. What did it mean, in a territory selling itself as modern and governable, to keep a woman in this place? The gendered double-bind inside the walls. Women in custody were often expected to perform two things at once: submission and femininity. A woman who remained defiant could be treated as unnatural. A woman who remained composed could be treated as manipulative. A woman who showed distress could be treated as unstable. A woman who showed resilience could be treated as cold. This is the double-bind. Whatever she does becomes evidence against her. The male prison adds another layer. The system's default language of control is built around male bodies and male shame. It relies on physical dominance, hierarchy among men, and the assumption that humiliation is a tool. With a woman, the institution risks appearing to humiliate femininity itself, an act that can trigger public discomfort even among people who demand harsh punishment. So the prison must be harsh without looking harsh. It must confine without seeming to endanger. It must impose discipline without creating a story of abuse. That kind of balancing act is difficult for any institution. It becomes harder in a place like Yuma, where the environment itself is already punishing. Heat does not care about propriety. The deeper contradiction, a prison built for forgetting. Yuma was designed to make the world forget the people inside it. Distance and climate did half the work. The rest was done by bureaucracy, intake, records, routine, silence. Pearl Hart was hard to forget. Not because she was uniquely violent or uniquely clever, but because she arrived with cultural energy attached. She arrived as a scandal, a novelty, a symbol, depending on who was speaking. The prison became part of that story. Prisons do not like being part of stories. A prison wants to be seen as an inevitable endpoint. You commit the crime, you end up here, and that is that. When the prison becomes a stage, it begins to look like a choice rather than a natural consequence. Choice invites judgment. Hart's presence invited judgment of the institution itself. How was she housed? How was she treated? Was her punishment proper? Was it too harsh? Too lenient? Too risky? Too indecent? Each question is a small crack in the prison's authority. Institutional discomfort does not announce itself. The important thing about institutional discomfort is that it rarely appears as a single dramatic moment. Bureaucracies do not say, "This is untenable." They shift. They request evaluations. They tighten or loosen restrictions. They adjust policies. They craft explanations. They consult superiors. They begin preparing an exit strategy. Discomfort becomes visible only in outcomes. With Hart, the outcome was early release. But before release, there is always a period where an institution tries to hold the line, tries to continue as though the sentence is simply being carried out as normal. This is where the prison's limits show. A prison can carry out almost any punishment if the punished body can be made ordinary. Hart could not be made ordinary. Her case would not stop being discussed. Her name would not stop circulating. Her presence would not stop generating institutional risk. The prison was not built to sustain that kind of symbolic pressure. The state's interest in avoiding a second spectacle. A court spectacle can be endured because it ends. A prison spectacle does not end until the prisoner leaves. Hart's continued confinement risked producing a prolonged spectacle, commentary on women in prison, commentary on propriety, commentary on whether the territory was civilized or brutal. These were not questions the state wanted attached to its prison. The territory had a future it was trying to secure. Institutions were part of that future. A prison that looked indecent or controversial could become evidence against the territory's readiness to govern itself. This is why early release cannot be understood only as compassion or practicality. It must be understood as strategic quieting. Release is sometimes the easiest way to end a tension. A sentence begins, a problem begins. When Hart entered Yuma, the punishment began. So did the institutional problem. The state had succeeded in convicting her under federal authority. It had placed her inside the harshest container available. It expected the story to go still. Instead, the story continued moving, through newspapers, through gossip, through the uneasy fascination attached to a woman who had worn men's clothing, raised a gun, and lived to be processed rather than destroyed. The prison could confine her body. It could not confine the meaning attached to her. And meaning, once loose, becomes an institutional hazard. The next phase of the story is where hazards are managed, where justifications are drafted, where the system begins to look for a way to end the problem without admitting the problem exists. It is the phase where punishment stops being a simple outcome and becomes a negotiation. Between law and optics. Between authority and propriety. Between what the sentence said and what the state could bear to keep doing. Chapter 5. Release as retreat. An early release is often narrated as mercy. In Pearl Hart's case, mercy is the least useful word available. It suggests moral clarity, a hard system softened, a guilty person granted leniency, a humane impulse rising above punishment. It is the kind of explanation institutions prefer because it flatters them. But the record of the Hart case, its speed, its publicity, its contradictions, points toward a different reading. This was not a system suddenly convinced of her goodness. It was a system unable to tolerate the consequences of its own sentence. Release was not the opposite of punishment. It was the system choosing to stop. To understand that choice, one has to examine what an early release solves. It solves problems prisons do not want to name. The practical reasons and the public reasons. Institutions seldom admit to symbolic discomfort. They speak instead in practical terms. A prison cannot say, "We cannot bear what this looks like." It says things like, the prisoner's health, the prisoner's condition, administrative feasibility, propriety, special circumstances, the public interest. Each phrase is a door the institution can use to exit a situation without announcing retreat. Pearl Hart's early release has often been attributed to pregnancy, propriety, or humanitarian concern. Those explanations circulate because they are plausible and because they fit a comforting idea about gender, that even a harsh system will hesitate to harm a woman in a particular condition. The difficulty is not that these reasons are impossible. The difficulty is that they do not fully account for the structural context. A woman should not have been placed in Yuma in the first place if propriety alone governed punishment. Yet she was. A sentence was imposed and carried out long enough to demonstrate authority. Then, when continuing that punishment risked becoming messy, the institution found a way to stop. This pattern, assertion followed by quiet adjustment, is more consistent with bureaucratic retreat than with simple mercy. Mercy would have required a moral statement. Retreat requires only a decision. The system made a decision. Release as a way to end a tension. Punishment is supposed to quiet a case. A criminal case becomes loud, then the court resolves it, then the offender disappears into a prison and the public moves on. That is the ideal. It protects institutions from ongoing scrutiny. It allows officials to close files and return to routine. Pearl Hart interfered with quiet. Her crime had already produced fascination because it violated gender expectation. Her trial magnified that fascination. Her imprisonment sustained it. The longer she remained inside Yuma, the longer the prison remained attached to the story. This is not a minor fact. Public attention can be corrosive to institutions, especially in an era when territorial legitimacy mattered and when the boundary between civilized governance and frontier brutality was politically sensitive. A territory that wanted to look modern did not benefit from extended public debate about what it meant to imprison a woman in a desert fortress built for men. Release ended the debate by removing the object of debate. The system did not have to justify Yuma's conditions any further if Hart was no longer there to make them visible. The offender as a mirror the system dislikes. Some offenders become mirrors. They reflect back the system's own assumptions, forcing officials and the public to confront things they prefer to keep implicit. Hart was such a mirror. She reflected the gendered nature of punishment by making the prison's default masculinity unmistakable. A male prisoner's suffering could be written off as expected. A woman's suffering could become a scandal. The system is not necessarily more humane toward women. It is often more anxious. Anxiety changes how punishment is administered. It creates caution that can appear as leniency, even when the underlying motive is self-protection. Hart also reflected another uncomfortable truth: the justice system depended on offenders performing certain emotional roles. It wanted contrition. It wanted shame. It wanted the punished body to look properly punished. Hart's public image, competent, uncollapsed, narratively active, made punishment harder to stage as moral instruction. She remained, in the public imagination, a figure of agency rather than a figure of ruin. That is dangerous to punishment's legitimacy. Legitimacy depends on the idea that punishment works. A woman who remains symbolically intact threatens that idea. How retreat is disguised. Retreat is never described as retreat. Institutions disguise it through procedure and language. They frame it as discretion, compassion, practical necessity, administrative order, a special exception that proves the system's humanity. This is why the story of Pearl Hart's release is often told with a tone of inevitability or sentiment. People like to believe that the system recognized something deserving in her. But the more consistent interpretation is that the system recognized something destabilizing. Her continued imprisonment was destabilizing. Her release restabilized the narrative. The state could present itself as flexible, humane, and sensible. It could claim that it had punished her and that further punishment was unnecessary. It could end the case without admitting that the case had begun to embarrass the institution. This is not a conspiracy. It is standard bureaucratic behavior. The machinery does not need malice to retreat. It needs only incentive. The timing of release matters. Timing is a clue. If an institution releases an offender immediately, it suggests reluctance to punish. If an institution keeps the offender long enough to demonstrate severity and then releases quietly, it suggests a different motive: to satisfy initial public demand and then minimize ongoing cost. Hart's release came after the system had already asserted itself. The conviction and sentencing proved authority. The prison intake proved follow-through. The state had made its point. Once the point had been made, the question became, how long must we keep making it? The longer Hart stayed, the less her confinement functioned as deterrence and the more it functioned as spectacle. Deterrence is a public good. Spectacle is a public hazard. Institutions prefer deterrence. When deterrence begins to look like spectacle, the system looks for a way to stop. The cost of keeping her was not moral, it was institutional. The simplest mistake in interpreting early release is to assume the cost was moral, that officials could not bear to do harm. The deeper cost is institutional. Keeping Hart meant continued public fascination, continued questions about prison propriety, continued risk of scandal, continued administrative burden of special housing, continued attention to a facility that wanted anonymity. It also meant keeping a female offender in a male prison long enough that the public might begin to see the punishment as something more complex than justice, something closer to humiliation, containment of femininity, or state cruelty. Those readings are dangerous to legitimacy. Institutions will accept many things. They will not accept sustained damage to their own authority. Thus the cost was not compassion for Hart. It was fear for the system. Release does not erase punishment. An early release is not absolution. It does not undo the conviction. It does not change the legal fact of guilt. It does not restore the money stolen or the threat imposed on stage passengers. But release changes the meaning of the case. It suggests that punishment is negotiable. It reveals that sentencing is not always the final word. It shows that institutions have thresholds of tolerance that are not written in statutes, but in culture. This is why Hart's case is so useful historically. It exposes a limit that is otherwise easy to miss. The system can punish a woman. It struggles to sustain punishment when punishment becomes publicly complicated. This limit is not written into law. It is written into social expectation and institutional self-preservation. The sentence the system could not bear to keep. Pearl Hart's release is often told as an ending. It is not. It is the beginning of the next institutional problem: what to do with a notorious woman once the state has let her out. How to manage her story. How to prevent her from becoming a living advertisement for defiance. How to turn release into quiet rather than into another chapter of spectacle. Institutions do not like unfinished business. They prefer their outcomes to feel complete. But Hart's release made the case feel unfinished to the public. People wanted either a villain destroyed or a repentant woman redeemed. Release offered neither. It left her alive, free, and legible. That unresolved quality is the true afterlife of this case. The court had declared guilt. The prison had imposed suffering. And then the system, unable to tolerate what continuing that suffering would mean, chose a different ending. Not reform. Not repentance. Not resolution. It cleared its throat and opened the gate. The rest of Hart's story lies in what happened next, how she disappeared, how her name lingered, and how the public rebuilt her into something it could tolerate: romance, novelty, legend, because the truth was more unsettling. The truth was that the system had punished her correctly and still could not finish the sentence. That is not mercy. That is retreat. Chapter 6. After release, a life without a script. Prisons are not only walls. They are conclusions. A sentence is meant to close a case. It tells the public, the state has taken control, the offender has been placed where she cannot disturb the world, order has been restored. When a prisoner is released early, that conclusion is interrupted. The case remains open in the public mind, not legally, but emotionally. People keep watching. The state may be finished with the problem of holding the offender, but it is rarely finished with the problem of what the offender represents. Release turns a contained symbol into a moving one. It returns the offender to the world without returning her to ordinary life. Pearl Hart's release did not offer a satisfying narrative. It did not provide the public with the pleasure of moral finality, and it did not provide the system with the comfort of a clean institutional ending. It created a new phase of instability, one that was solved not through further punishment, but through disappearance. Hart left custody into a world that did not have a script ready for her. The difficulty of being a famous offender. Most offenders are forgotten quickly. Their names never travel far. They do their time, return to obscurity, and the world continues. Hart was not granted that anonymity. Even if she had wanted it desperately, the case had already turned her into a story. A woman who held up a stagecoach at gunpoint was the kind of novelty the newspapers could not resist, and novelty, once printed, is hard to retract. It is important to understand what fame meant in this period. It was not social media celebrity. It was a kind of portable notoriety, the ability of a name to move through paper and conversation, carried from town to town. It was not constant attention, but it was unpredictable attention. It could flare up without warning. A famous offender lives under a different kind of pressure. Strangers think they know her. Men approach her for the story. Reporters treat her as copy. Communities treat her as risk. Respectability becomes difficult to purchase. The justice system does not provide support for this phase. It is not built to reintegrate notorious people. It is built to punish and then release into nothing. A male outlaw could sometimes convert notoriety into work, myth, or protection. A woman could rarely do so safely. For a woman, notoriety invited a particular kind of attention, moral judgment mixed with voyeurism, fascination mixed with contempt. Hart re-entered the world carrying that burden. The disappearance as an institutional and personal solution. There are two kinds of disappearance after release. One is the mythic disappearance. The outlaw vanishes into open country, reinvents herself, escapes history. The other is the bureaucratic disappearance. The record simply stops because no institution has a reason to keep writing. Pearl Hart's post-release life belongs largely to the second kind. She fades from the official file because the system's interest in her diminishes once she is no longer in custody. That does not mean she ceased to exist, it means she ceased to be administratively useful. This is a recurring pattern in women's criminal history. A woman can be intensely documented at the point of arrest and trial, then almost absent afterwards. The state records the moment it controls her. When it stops controlling her, it stops recording her. This produces fertile ground for legend. When the record thins, stories grow in the empty space. Hart has been found and lost repeatedly by later accounts, placed in different cities, assigned different marriages, given different endings. Some of these claims may be true. Some are likely not. The responsible approach is to treat the record's thinning as a fact in itself. The system let her go and did not look back with the same intensity. The state was not interested in her reinvention. The public was. The public's need to rebuild her. A female offender cannot remain simply a robber in public memory. She must be reshaped into something the culture can tolerate. There are only a few templates available. The tragic woman forced by circumstance. The comic novelty, playing at masculinity. The seductive accomplice, led by desire. The fallen woman, punished and warned. The romantic outlaw, rendered safe by myth. Each template reduces the discomfort created by her agency. Pearl Hart's agency is what disturbed people. She was not merely present at a robbery, she actively committed one. She held the gun. She participated in the taking. She crossed gender lines in clothing and conduct. The public could not leave that fact raw. It had to be cooked into a familiar story. This is where the system and the public subtly align. The justice system wants cases to settle. It wants the public to accept that order has returned. Myth-making can help with that. If the offender becomes a romance tale or a cautionary morality play, the public stops asking uncomfortable questions about the prison, the release, and the state's hesitation. Legend becomes a kind of social containment. When the prison could not hold her indefinitely, narrative tried to. Reform and the suspicion of women's change. After release, offenders are often judged not by what they do, but by whether they perform the correct emotions. Reform is not only behavioral, it is theatrical. A reformed woman is supposed to look modest, contrite, domesticated. She is supposed to shrink into privacy. She is supposed to accept the judgment placed upon her and disappear as proof that punishment worked. Hart's case makes this theater visible by its absence. We do not have a robust record of her repentance or her transformation because the institutions did not document it. The silence itself becomes suspicious in later retellings, which is why writers often fill it with imagined reform or imagined relapse. The truth is quieter. The record does not show a continuing criminal career. Hart does not become a repeat headline through known offenses. That absence is significant. It suggests that the system released a woman who was not, in practical terms, a continuing violent threat. The original offense had been public and serious, but it was also bounded in time and circumstance. The system's fear had not been primarily about future danger. It had been about present embarrassment. After release, embarrassment could be managed if Hart stayed quiet. So quietness, whether chosen by her or imposed by circumstance, became the condition under which she could remain free. The gendered risk of ordinary life. For a man, leaving prison could mean returning to labor, travel, anonymity. For a woman, ordinary life required social permission. A woman without family protection or respectable ties could be pushed back toward the margins where survival depended on informal economies. This matters because many of the public narratives about Hart assume she simply started over. Starting over is not a simple act in this era, especially for a woman carrying criminal notoriety. To rent a room, to gain employment, to be taken seriously as a worker, to avoid harassment, these depended on reputation. Notoriety is the opposite of reputation. It attracts precisely the people who exploit, not the people who stabilize. Thus Hart's post-release life, whatever its details, would have required careful navigation. A woman can disappear not by vanishing into wilderness, but by shrinking her visibility, changing names, moving often, limiting social ties, choosing marriages or arrangements that offer cover. These are not romantic acts. They are survival tactics. The legend of the outlaw imagines freedom as open space. For women, freedom often required hiding. What the early release really accomplished. Hart's early release solved the prison's problem. It reduced scrutiny. It restored administrative quiet. It removed a difficult symbol from a difficult place. But it did not erase the case. In a sense, it displaced it. The institution stopped holding her body. The public kept holding her story. That story began to drift away from the legal facts. The robbery became a folk tale. The woman became a character. The discomfort of the state's retreat became invisible under the more appealing narrative of a bold female bandit. This transformation is not accidental. It is what happens when a case cannot offer closure. Culture manufactures closure through myth. The myth says, she was an outlaw, she was brave, she was punished, she was released, she vanished. A tidy arc, satisfying and safe. The reality is less tidy and more instructive. The state enforced the law and then quietly backed away from its own sentence, because keeping her became harder than letting her go. That reality is not romantic. It is administrative. The life outside as the last institutional test. The most revealing part of Hart's story is not the robbery. It is not even the conviction. It is the transition from custody to the world. It shows what punishment can and cannot accomplish. It shows that prison is not always a finishing act. It shows that release can be motivated not by confidence in rehabilitation, but by fear of continued scrutiny. And it shows that when the system releases a symbol, it depends on society to help contain her in another way, through stigma, legend, and the constant demand that she behave quietly. A famous male offender can sometimes live loudly. A famous female offender is often permitted freedom only if she becomes invisible. Hart's disappearance, therefore, is not a footnote. It is part of the institutional story. The system could not bear to keep her. The world could not bear to know what to do with her. So she moved into the only available space, the thin territory between notoriety and anonymity, where a woman survives by refusing to become a story again. The next question is not where she went. The next question is what the case became once she was no longer available as a living object of punishment, how the myth hardened, how the record thinned, and how the justice system's retreat was rewritten as something more palatable. Because in the end, Pearl Hart was released from prison. She was not released from meaning. Chapter 7, Legend as Containment. When an institution releases a notorious offender, it does not end the case. It changes the method of control. Prison is one kind of containment, physical, explicit, administered by the state. The public narrative that follows release can become another kind, informal, cultural, administered through repetition. In cases involving women, this second containment often works more efficiently than the first, because it is enforced through social shame, fascination, and the narrowing of acceptable identities. Pearl Hart's disappearance after release did not create a blank space. It created a vacuum. And vacuums in famous criminal cases do not remain empty for long. They are filled by story. The story is not neutral. It is a solution. It allows the public to keep the case in circulation without keeping the discomfort that the case originally generated. A woman with a gun and a stagecoach at her mercy is culturally intolerable as a raw fact. The culture therefore processes the fact into something safer. The result is legend. Legend does not merely entertain. It disciplines. Why the public needs the legend. A straight account of the Hart case, even stripped to essentials, produces an awkward institutional truth. The system punished her correctly and still retreated. That truth unsettles the public's faith in punishment as a stable mechanism. People want punishment to be definitive. They want the court to speak and the matter to close. They want prison to function as an endpoint. When the state releases an offender early, especially an offender whose crime was both public and defiant, it introduces doubt into the punishment narrative. Why wasn't the sentence completed? What changed? Was the system unsure? Was the system weak? Was it cruel and then embarrassed? Was the offender being favored? These questions produce the kind of social irritation that institutions and communities dislike. Irritation tends to demand explanation. Explanation tends to become moral argument. Moral argument can destabilize legitimacy. Legend solves this problem by shifting attention away from institutions and back onto personality. If the case is framed as a romance, the release becomes part of the romance. If the case is framed as novelty, the release becomes a punchline. If the case is framed as tragedy, the release becomes mercy. In each version, the institutional retreat disappears. This is why legend is not merely accidental. It is culturally useful. The available templates for a female offender. Male criminals have a wide range of cultural narratives available to them: outlaw, rebel, villain, anti-hero, victim of circumstance, working-class martyr, political dissident. Female criminals have fewer. For women, the public tends to sort into narrower categories: the seduced accomplice, the fallen woman, the mad woman, the monster, the novelty, woman as man. The romantic outlaw who is safe because she is beautiful or doomed. Pearl Hart has been pulled into several of these templates at once. She becomes, depending on the teller, a desperate abandoned wife, a saloon girl pushed too far, a woman acting out male fantasies, an early feminist outlaw, a comic frontier oddity. The point is not to argue that every retelling is deliberately deceptive. The point is to show what the culture does when a woman's agency appears too stark. Agency is unsettling. Templates soften it. How myth replaces the archive. The thinning of the record after Hart's release is one reason the legend grows. When official documentation stops, later writers begin to rely on newspaper anecdotes, second-hand recollections, and repetition of earlier retellings. Repetition is dangerous because it creates the illusion of confirmation. When a detail appears in many places, readers assume it must be true. Often it is only recycled. This is a particular hazard in historical true crime. A case that has become part of folklore will generate facts that have no primary source. Each later account borrows from the last, and the story becomes smoother and more dramatic over time. Smoothness is a warning sign. Real institutional records are jagged. They contain contradictions, omissions, boring administrative language, and sudden gaps. Legend removes those rough edges. Legend also loves the kind of detail that feels symbolic: a disguise, a sharp line spoken in court, a final wink, a clever gesture. These details may be true or may be invented. In either case, they serve the same purpose: they turn a person into a character. A character is easier to contain than a human being. The myth of freedom and the reality of constraint. One of the most persistent elements in outlaw legend is freedom. The outlaw is imagined as moving through open space, unbound by rules, escaping the dullness of ordinary life. For women, this myth carries a special charge because ordinary life was itself bounded by marriage, reputation, domestic labor, and vulnerability. A woman with a gun becomes, in legend, a woman with agency. But the historical reality is that women's agency after release was constrained by housing and employment barriers, the risk of harassment and exploitation, the moral policing of communities, legal vulnerability, the difficulty of changing identity without resources. Thus the legend of Pearl Hart as free-roaming outlaw is a story the public tells itself, not necessarily the life she lived. It is a fantasy designed to make her bearable. If she is a romantic outlaw, then her crime can be enjoyed as entertainment. If she is a desperate woman, then her crime can be forgiven as necessity. If she is a novelty, then her crime can be laughed at and dismissed. Each fantasy reduces the need to confront the institutional truth. The system's authority wavered because it could not sustain her punishment without destabilizing itself. The prison disappears inside the legend. Legends about Hart often focus on the robbery itself, because that is the most cinematic element: the road, the gun, the stagecoach, the disguise. The prison phase is less romantic. It requires discussing heat, routine, administrative discomfort. It requires looking at how the state functions. Legend does not like bureaucracy. It likes drama. So the prison is minimized, and release is treated as a natural endpoint rather than as an institutional decision shaped by anxiety. This matters because it changes what the case teaches. If Hart's story is only a robbery tale, it becomes a quaint frontier episode. If Hart's story includes the prison and release, it becomes a case study in punishment's limits. Legend protects the system by steering away from the second reading. The system benefits from the legend. This is the most uncomfortable point. The state benefits when legend replaces institutional scrutiny. A mythic outlaw story does not ask why the prison did not complete the sentence. It does not ask how officials justified release. It does not ask whether gender influenced decisions. It does not ask what it meant for a territory to maintain legitimacy through selective punishment. Legend is depoliticizing. It turns a structural question into entertainment. That transformation reduces pressure on institutions. It allows them to carry on as though nothing unusual occurred. The system does not have to defend itself if the public is busy enjoying a story. This is why, even when a legend appears to celebrate a criminal, it can still function as containment. It channels attention away from institutional power. The offender becomes a character, the system becomes scenery. The cost of legend, flattening the real person. The cost of legend is paid by the truth. Pearl Hart becomes whatever the teller needs her to be. She stops being a person whose decisions were shaped by economic pressure, gender constraint, personal history, and a specific territorial legal context. She becomes a symbol. Symbols are stripped of contradiction. They do not age. They do not get sick. They do not suffer ordinary consequences. They do not disappear into poverty or anonymity. They live forever in the same pose. That pose is useful to the culture. It is not necessarily respectful to the human being. A serious historical account must resist the pose. This does not mean stripping the story of all drama. It means refusing to allow drama to replace the record. The case as a warning about memory. Pearl Hart's story demonstrates a general truth about famous women criminals. Society often decides what they mean before it decides what actually happened. The meaning is selected to preserve comfort. The frontier remains romantic. The prison remains firm. The state remains competent. The woman becomes either a caution or a novelty. The uncomfortable institutional fact, retreat, becomes faint. This is why the post-release phase matters as much as the robbery. It shows how cases are managed after formal punishment ends. It shows how a culture can continue to discipline a woman even after the state releases her, by controlling the narrative space she is allowed to occupy. A woman can be freed from a cell and still confined to a story. The legend is the last container. The stagecoach was the first container, a moving institution interrupted. The courtroom was the second, guilt translated into legal language. The prison was the third, punishment applied in heat and routine. The legend was the last, meaning fixed so the case could be carried safely. If the prison could not bear to keep Pearl Hart, the culture could still keep her in circulation, smoothed, simplified, made tolerable. That is what legend does. It allows the public to hold the offender at a distance, while still enjoying the thrill of her transgression. This book will not compete with legend. It does not need to. It will do something less flattering and more useful. It will keep returning to the institutional question the legend tries to hide. Not, was she daring? Not, was she romantic? Not, was she a symbol? But, what did the state do when it realized it could not finish the sentence it had imposed? Because that is the part of Pearl Hart's story that does not belong to folklore. It belongs to history. Chapter 8, A Woman with a Gun. Gender, fear, and the punishment the public wanted. Pearl Hart did not need to fire a shot to become threatening. The gun was enough. The road was enough. The stagecoach was enough. The fact that she was a woman was enough. Together, these elements created a kind of public disturbance that far exceeded the practical harm of the robbery itself. This chapter is not about whether Hart was ahead of her time, or whether she should be celebrated. It is about what her case reveals, that punishment is not only a legal response to harm. It is also a social ritual aimed at restoring categories. When a woman commits a public armed offense, the system is forced to defend not only property and safety, but the boundary between masculine authority and feminine submission. That boundary is not written into law, yet it sits behind law like a set of invisible instructions. The state can process a robbery. It struggles to process a woman who makes robbery look possible for women. The frontier's gendered bargain. The 19th century frontier is often described as a place of loosened rules. In reality, it relied on strict ones. Frontier communities could tolerate disorder in certain forms, but they policed women's behavior intensely because women's behavior was treated as proof of civilization. A town with respectable women could claim legitimacy. A town with disorderly women, women who drank openly, lived independently, slept outside marriage, or moved between men, was portrayed as unstable. This was not a moral concern alone. It was economic and political. Mining money, land investment, and territorial status depended on the appearance of order. Thus women were used as markers. Respectable women were used to prove the frontier was becoming a society. Bad women were used to prove the frontier was still a danger. Pearl Hart's offense hit this system of meaning at its most sensitive point. She did not merely behave outside respectable femininity. She seized a masculine instrument, armed threat, and used it in public. That is why the robbery was experienced as something more than theft. Crime as category violation. A man who robbed a coach fit a familiar story: frontier criminality, fading but not gone, a remnant of the old days. The system could frame him as a final example of what civilization was overcoming. A woman who robbed a coach did not fit that story. She implied a different possibility, that the categories themselves were unstable. If a woman could do this, what else could she do? If a woman could do this, what did woman mean? If a woman could do this, what did male authority protect? These questions are rarely spoken openly in the record. They appear instead as tone, shock, fascination, disgust, obsessive attention to clothing and appearance, and a repeated insistence on explaining her. Explanation is a symptom of category violation. When something fits, it is not explained. When something does not fit, society talks until it produces a frame that calms the nervous system. Hart made the nervous system loud. The public's appetite for a proper ending. In cases like Hart's, the public tends to demand one of two endings: destruction, a harsh sentence, complete containment; domestication, repentance, marriage, moral collapse into femininity. Both endings restore order. Destruction removes the threat. Domestication converts it into something recognizable. The public does not, in general, tolerate the third possibility, that a woman can do the thing and remain neither destroyed nor domesticated. That possibility suggests that social control is not absolute. So punishment in such cases becomes theatrical. It must teach. The court sentence was part of that teaching. A significant federal conviction and a severe prison term said to the public, the state can still discipline a woman who refuses her category. But punishment must also look appropriate. If the punishment appears indecent or cruel, it can backfire. It can provoke sympathy. It can expose the system's own violence. It can cause the public to focus not on the offender's transgression but on the state's. This is why women's punishment so often swings between severity and retreat. The state has to satisfy the demand for order while avoiding the moral discomfort of appearing to crush femininity. Hart forced that balancing act into the open. The female offender as spectacle. The press did not treat Pearl Hart as it treated male robbers. It treated her as a spectacle. Spectacle is not merely reporting. It is a form of public consumption. It invites readers to look not only at the crime but at the offender's body, face, clothing, and manner. It asks, is she pretty, is she ugly, is she womanly, is she hard, does she smile, does she cry? These questions are not harmless. They shape what punishment feels justified. A woman who is perceived as unfeminine is punished more comfortably. A woman who is perceived as attractive can be sexualized and treated as a fantasy. A woman who performs sorrow can be treated as redeemable. A woman who refuses sorrow can be treated as cold. The system, too, is influenced by these perceptions. Judges, jurors, wardens, governors, none are immune to cultural scripts. Thus the spectacle is not an extra layer added by newspapers. It is part of the environment in which legal decisions are made. Hart's case did not occur inside a sterile courtroom bubble. It occurred inside a society actively deciding what kind of woman she was allowed to be. Bad women, and the convenient moral label. Women who lived independently in saloon environments were often labeled prostitutes, whether or not the label was accurate. The label did not need to be proven. It functioned as a moral category, a way to make a woman's story feel already decided. Once labeled, the woman's violence could be explained as part of her fallen nature rather than as a particular choice made in a particular context. The label also reassured the public that respectable women were safe because the offender was not one of them. This is another form of containment. It prevents the public from having to confront that a woman outside the domestic sphere could still be intelligent, strategic, and agentic. It reduces her to type. In Hart's case, the fallen woman label has been used repeatedly to make her offense feel less threatening to respectable society. If she is already outside the moral order, then her crime is not evidence that the order is porous. It becomes evidence that those women are dangerous. This is a comforting lie. The truth is that the frontier's moral order depended on women's vulnerability. It depended on punishing those who stepped outside it. Hart demonstrated that vulnerability was not total. The state's fear of setting a precedent. Institutions are built on precedent, whether they admit it or not. A harsh sentence is not only punishment for one offender, it is a message to potential offenders. In a case like Hart's, the fear is not only that stagecoach robberies might increase. It is that women might learn a new kind of public defiance. This fear is rarely articulated openly. It is embedded in phrases like deterrence and public safety. But deterrence is never just about the act, it is about what the act symbolizes. The system therefore had strong incentive to punish Hart decisively at the front end: convict, sentence, imprison. The state had to show that a woman could not break into masculine violence without being met by masculine authority. And yet, as we have seen, sustaining that punishment created new problems. The prison became uncomfortable, the optics became unstable, the case refused to quiet. This is the institutional trap. The state wants to deter by severity, but severity can produce scrutiny. Scrutiny produces doubt. Doubt undermines the deterrent message. So the state punishes harshly, and then backs away quietly. The quiet back away is not part of the deterrent message. It is hidden. The double message: severity in public, retreat in practice. Pearl Hart's case is instructive because it shows the double message clearly. Publicly, the system presented severity, a federal conviction and prison time in one of the territory's harshest facilities. Privately, the system moved toward retreat, early release, and a diminishing of institutional contact. This double message is not a contradiction. It is a strategy. Severity satisfies public appetite for order. Retreat protects institutions from ongoing harm. This is how systems maintain legitimacy in cases that threaten to destabilize them. They give the public an initial show of firmness, then manage the afterlife quietly. Hart's case demonstrates this with unusual clarity because the offense was not ambiguous and the release was not cleanly narratable as rehabilitation. The state could not claim she had been transformed. It could only remove her from the prison's orbit and allow the story to settle into folklore rather than policy debate. What the public feared, and what it actually wanted. The public's fear was not only that Hart might rob again. The deeper fear was that she had revealed something about the frontier, that it was not as governed as it wanted to be, and that the boundaries of gendered behavior were not as secure as the culture claimed. The public's demand for punishment was, therefore, also a demand for reassurance. Reassurance that women who step outside their place will be corrected. Reassurance that men still control violence. Reassurance that institutions still hold. When the prison released Hart early, it threatened that reassurance. That is why the legend became useful. The legend restored comfort by turning her into a story rather than a precedent. A story can be enjoyed. A precedent must be confronted. This is one of the most important distinctions in understanding the case's afterlife. The meaning of Pearl Hart, stripped of romance. If one removes the romance and the moral theater, what remains is stark. Pearl Hart committed an armed robbery and was punished under federal law. The punishment was not completed as imposed. The system retreated, and then allowed culture to contain the case through myth. Hart's enduring interest is not that she was a woman robber. It is that she reveals the system's dependence on gender scripts to make punishment feel coherent, and the system's tendency to retreat when those scripts fail to produce a comfortable ending. She did not defeat the system in court. She did not escape the prison in the literal sense. But she did something rarer. She made the system's authority look awkward. And awkwardness is one of the things institutions will work hardest to erase. The next chapter turns from the public story to the administrative one, what early release required behind the scenes, how officials framed it, and what the case reveals about discretion, how it functions, how it hides, and how it becomes the quiet engine of justice when the law's clarity becomes too difficult to sustain. Chapter 9. Discretion. The law does not run itself. Between statute and sentence, between sentence and confinement, between confinement and release, decisions are made by people who rarely call themselves decision-makers. They call themselves officials. Discretion is the space where officials operate. It is the quiet, flexible part of the system that allows institutions to adapt without rewriting the law. It can function as mercy. It can function as bias. It can function as self-protection. It can function as politics. It can function as avoidance. Most often, it functions as a tool for restoring institutional comfort. Pearl Hart's early release was not a mystery in the sense of a whodunit. It was a discretionary outcome. The question is not what happened but how the system made it happen, how it framed the decision so it would not look like retreat, and how it used the language of administration to smooth an uncomfortable case back into order. This chapter follows that mechanism. Discretion as the system's escape hatch. A justice system that cannot adapt will eventually shatter. Even harsh systems require valves, ways to relieve pressure when a case becomes socially volatile. Discretion is that valve. It appears in many forms. Prosecutorial charging decisions, bail and pretrial handling, jury mercy, judicial sentencing choices within ranges, prison classification and management, commutation, pardons and parole, medical and humanitarian releases, informal arrangements justified as common sense. Discretion is rarely presented as power. It is presented as pragmatism. It pretends to be neutral and reasonable. In reality, it is one of the main ways social values leak into legal outcomes. Pearl Hart's case is a textbook example, because the public-facing story, conviction and imprisonment, was severe and clear, yet the outcome, early release, was a deviation. Deviations require explanation. Discretion provides it. The difference between legal logic and institutional logic. Legal logic asks, was the offense proven? Was the charge correct? Was the sentence lawful? Did procedure comply? Institutional logic asks, can we sustain the consequences of this choice? These logics overlap, but they are not the same. Hart's conviction and sentence satisfied legal logic. Her continued confinement challenged institutional logic. The prison had to sustain a punishment that was producing unwanted attention and administrative complication. Once that complication reached a certain threshold, legal certainty no longer guaranteed institutional commitment. Institutions do not collapse over one case. They adjust. Adjustment happens through discretion. Discretion and the language of special circumstances. The most common way discretion is justified is through special circumstances. The offender becomes an exception. The exception preserves the illusion that the system remains coherent. Officials do not have to admit the system is not built for certain situations. They can claim this case is unusually complex. Pearl Hart could be framed as unusually complex in several ways. A woman in a male prison. A notorious offender attracting attention. An offender whose continued incarceration raised propriety issues. An offender whose situation could be framed as humanitarian. An offender whose continued custody created administrative risk. Notice what is missing. The exception does not need to be about guilt. It does not need to be about the offense. It needs to be about the system's difficulty in carrying out its own chosen consequence. Special circumstances is the polite name for institutional discomfort. Who benefits when discretion is used quietly? Discretion can benefit offenders. It can also benefit institutions. In Hart's case, it is unlikely to be properly understood unless one accepts that the institution benefited significantly from release. Release reduced scrutiny. Release reduced administrative complexity. Release reduced the risk of scandal. Release removed a symbolic irritant from the prison. In that sense, discretion functioned less like a gift to Hart and more like a gift to the system. This is why discretionary outcomes are often misunderstood as mercy. Mercy is personal and moral. Discretion is structural and strategic. It can be compassionate, but it is also frequently self-interested. Institutions practice self-interest under the banner of order. Discretion as a way to avoid accountability. A formal decision invites formal scrutiny. A formal pardon invites public debate. A formal commutation invites outrage. A formal policy change invites questions about who else is affected. Quiet discretionary release avoids these hazards. It creates an outcome without creating a spectacle. It is bureaucratic, not theatrical. Bureaucratic outcomes are harder to challenge because they are framed as routine. They appear as paperwork, not as a moral decision. The public rarely sees the internal reasoning. The record, if it survives, may contain only bland phrasing. This blandness is deliberate. It protects officials from being pinned to motives. Pearl Hart's early release becomes, in this light, not a dramatic reversal but an administrative act designed to produce quiet. Quiet is one of the system's deepest desires. Discretion and gender, the soft power of propriety. Gender is one of the most powerful drivers of discretionary decision-making because it operates under the name of propriety rather than ideology. Officials could justify special handling for Hart by appealing to decency, protection, morality, the inappropriateness of certain conditions for a woman. These appeals look humane. They can even be humane. But they also conceal a deeper truth. The prison system was designed around men and was forced to admit that design when Hart appeared. A woman in a male prison reveals the prison's masculinity. That revelation is politically dangerous. So the institution becomes anxious. Anxiety produces discretionary action. Hart's gender could therefore simultaneously increase the desire to punish her, because she violated femininity, and increase the desire to release her, because keeping her punished made the system look awkward. This is the gendered paradox of punishment. Women can be punished harshly in theory, but the visible performance of that harshness can make the punisher look indecent. Discretion is how the system navigates that paradox. The frontier state and the need to appear governable. Arizona Territory at the end of the 19th century was not simply managing crime. It was managing image. Territories had to demonstrate stability, order, and competence. Institutions such as prisons were part of that demonstration. A prison that became controversial could damage the territory's narrative of progress. Controversy could be used by critics as evidence that the territory was not ready to govern itself. Even if that political context is not explicitly documented in every decision, it forms part of the environment in which officials act. Discretion is often shaped by what officials do not want to invite. Hart invited the wrong kind of conversation, not only about crime, but about the state's capacity to punish without appearing brutal or absurd. Early release prevented that conversation from deepening. Discretion and the creation of closure. The public wants closure. Institutions want closure. But closure is not always available through formal legal endings, especially when the case remains symbolically charged. Discretion can manufacture closure by moving the problem out of view. If Hart is released and disappears, the public gradually loses the capacity to keep demanding answers. The case drifts into legend. The drift feels like closure even though it is not a legal or moral completion. This is one of discretion's most significant functions. It turns unresolved problems into forgotten ones. Prison is not the only way a system can end a case. Obscurity can do the work too. Discretion as a moral hazard. Discretion is necessary for flexibility, but it is also a moral hazard because it allows unequal outcomes without formal justification. Two offenders can commit similar crimes and receive different fates depending on gender, class, race, notoriety, political climate, institutional convenience. Pearl Hart's case exposes this hazard because her outcome feels anomalous. A convicted armed robber released early is not the standard story. The anomaly invites the reader to ask, what is punishment actually for? If punishment is for deterrence, why release early? If punishment is for retribution, why stop? If punishment is for rehabilitation, where is the record of reform? The answers point back to institutional convenience. Discretion is where convenience enters justice most easily. What discretion reveals about the system's limits? In the end, Hart's early release tells us something simple and unsettling. The system is not purely a machine that punishes according to rules. It is a set of institutions that punish as far as they can tolerate. Tolerance is social. It changes by era, community, and the offender's symbolic charge. A man with a gun could be tolerated inside Yuma as routine. A woman with a gun made the routine look like a choice. Once punishment looked like a choice, it became open to judgment. Officials did not want that judgment attached to them or their institution. Discretion provided the exit. Hart's case therefore belongs to a category of stories where the most important act is not the crime. It is the system's decision to stop. A law can demand a sentence. Only institutions can decide whether they will endure what the sentence means. This chapter has named that decision-making space. The next chapter turns to the most intimate mechanism of discretion, the body. Not Hart's psychology, not her legend, but the way the female body itself became an administrative complication, how institutions manage women by managing their biology, their vulnerability, and the public meaning attached to their physical existence. Because in cases like this, the body is not only a body. It is a policy problem. Chapter 10. The Body as Evidence. For a woman in custody, the body is never only a body. It is a site of supervision, a source of rumor, a trigger for moral panic, and, at moments of administrative strain, an exit route. Male prisoners are managed as labor, discipline, and risk. Female prisoners are managed as meaning. Their physical existence inside a carceral institution produces questions the institution must answer, and those questions rarely stay practical for long. Pearl Hart's early release is often explained through the body. The most repeated claim is pregnancy, that she was freed because she was expecting, and because keeping her in Yuma became inappropriate. Whether that specific claim was true, exaggerated, or strategically deployed, the deeper mechanism remains historically consistent. The system has always used women's bodies as administrative justification. It is not necessary to romanticize this. It is not even necessary to settle every disputed detail to understand what the institution was doing. It was protecting itself. Why pregnancy works as an institutional explanation. Pregnancy, real or alleged, has a peculiar power inside punishment systems. It turns a sentence into a public relations problem. It shifts the moral center of the story away from the offender and toward the state's conduct. A prison can justify cruelty to a convicted robber more easily than it can justify cruelty to a pregnant woman, particularly in a public case, particularly when the offender is already a spectacle, particularly when the institution is in a territory anxious about legitimacy. That is why pregnancy, in many periods and places, has functioned as a kind of administrative lever. It forces discretionary decision-making while allowing officials to describe retreat as decency. Pearl Hart's story sits neatly in this logic. Contemporary and later accounts repeatedly note that she served only a fraction of her sentence and that the reason circulated widely as pregnancy. The point is not to treat the claim as proven simply because it is repeated. The point is to recognize why this is the claim the culture clung to. It provides a socially acceptable rationale for a decision that otherwise looks like institutional discomfort. If the state said, "We cannot bear to keep her," it would reveal weakness. If it said, "We released her for humanitarian reasons," it could still look authoritative. Pregnancy is a humane reason that requires no confession. The prison's problem was not only danger, it was decency. Hart's presence inside Yuma made the institution legible. It exposed the prison's masculine design and forced officials into continual choices that were both logistical and reputational. Where do you house her? Who watches her? What access does she have? What do you do with visitors, reporters, and the curious? How do you stop the prison from becoming part of the entertainment? A prison can manage violence. It can manage escape attempts. It can manage illness. What it struggles to manage is prolonged attention, particularly when that attention is moralizing. Hart attracted that kind of attention because she was a woman, because she was notorious, and because the crime had been reported as a kind of social transgression. Decency, in such a context, becomes more than a virtue. It becomes a shield. It allows officials to frame their decision-making as moral rather than strategic. This is one of the ways institutions preserve legitimacy. They disguise self-protection as propriety. The female offender as a reproductive risk. Even when pregnancy is not present, the possibility of it is enough to shape how institutions behave. A woman in custody is routinely treated as a reproductive risk, a body that could become medically complicated, scandalously implicated, or politically controversial. The prison must avoid the appearance of sexual access, abuse, or impropriety. The prison must avoid any outcome that could be framed as institutional violation. That fear produces special treatment that looks like care, but often functions as segregation and control. Hart's case illustrates the paradox. The prison system treated her as a disruptive problem, but the very measures taken to manage her kept her distinct, and distinction kept her visible. Visibility kept the story alive. The body created the administrative loop. Special handling. Increased visibility. Increased public fascination. Increased institutional risk. Stronger incentive to end the case. Release becomes the simplest way to break the loop. What we can say about her life after release. When the gate opens, the archive usually closes. In Hart's case, the record becomes uneven and sometimes contradictory. Even strong sources acknowledge that many details of her later life are uncertain. But there are a few stabilizing points that recur across higher quality reference summaries and Arizona-based holdings. Hart was born Pearl Taylor in Canada, likely in 1871. She had been married earlier in life to a man named Frank Hart. Later, she is reported to have married George Calvin Cal Bywater. Children appear in the record as well. Widely used reference summaries list 2 children, Joe and Emma Hart. As for the end of her life, she is generally recorded as dying on December 30, 1955 in Gila County, Arizona. That location matters. It places her at the end, not in some romantic elsewhere but back in the region that first made her notorious. She did not die in a blaze of outlawry. She died as an old woman in the ordinary way, in the ordinary time that most people are not granted in the stories told about them. That ordinariness is important. It is the one detail folklore tends to resist. The brief attempt to convert notoriety into livelihood. The public often imagines 2 post-prison paths for infamous offenders, either reinvention into respectability or collapse into repeat crime. Hart's story suggests something else as well, a short period where notoriety was treated as a resource. At least one major account describes her joining a Wild West show briefly after release before fading from public view. This fits the broader pattern of the era. Popular entertainment had an appetite for criminal novelty, especially female novelty, and institutions were not displeased to see a notorious offender move into performance rather than politics. Performance contains what law cannot. It turns a disruptive figure into a ticketed attraction. If Hart did appear in such settings, it would not represent triumph over the system. It would represent absorption into another institution that specializes in converting public unease into spectacle. Disappearance as the final bargain. Whatever precise sequence of jobs, moves, marriages, and names followed, the larger shape is clear. Hart's continued freedom depended on her willingness, or her necessity, to become less visible. A woman can leave prison and still be held in a public story. To live outside that story, she must shrink her footprint. She may change names. She may marry. She may move. She may accept the dullness of ordinary life as protection. The public celebrates the outlaw phase because it is vivid. The public neglects the quiet phase because it refuses drama. But the quiet phase is where the real cost sits. It is where a person learns that freedom is conditional on becoming less legible. Hart's afterlife in the archive is thin not because she stopped existing, but because the system stopped needing her as an object. The case that had once been loud was allowed to become quiet, by her, by the state, by time. What the body ultimately did in this story. Pearl Hart's body mattered to the system in 3 distinct ways. First, it made the crime culturally explosive. A woman performing armed robbery forced the public to confront the instability of gendered authority. Second, it made imprisonment administratively awkward. A female body inside a male-designed prison turned routine punishment into a question of propriety, attention, and legitimacy. Third, it provided the language through which retreat could be justified. Pregnancy, health, decency, special circumstances, whether invoked as fact, as rumor, or as rationale, allowed the institution to stop without admitting it had been strained. This is the central irony. The justice system is supposed to treat defendants as legal subjects. In practice, it treated Hart as something more complicated, a legal subject whose body threatened to turn punishment into scandal. So it ended the problem the easiest way it could. It stopped holding her. And then it allowed the public to hold her instead, first as spectacle, then as legend, and finally, as a name that fades at the edge of the archive, attached to a death in Gila County in 1955, long after the stagecoaches had become memorabilia. Chapter 11. The Selling of Pearl Hart. Notoriety is a kind of currency, but it is a currency that spends unevenly. For men in the 19th century, criminal fame could be converted, sometimes, into money, protection, even a rough kind of status. For women, notoriety was more unstable. It carried moral judgment as part of its price. A woman could be famous and still be treated as disposable. She could be fascinating and still be denied ordinary safety. Pearl Hart's post-release life sits in this unstable zone. The archive thins. The public story thickens. And in the space between what institutions recorded and what the culture wanted, a third force enters: commerce. The case becomes a product. This chapter follows that shift, how a woman convicted of a serious crime can be moved, after release, from offender to commodity, and how that transformation quietly serves institutions as much as it serves entertainment. The public does not want an offender, it wants a character. A convicted robber is inconvenient. A convicted robber raises questions about sentencing, prisons, rehabilitation, and whether the state's choices make sense. A convicted robber invites policy debate and moral discomfort, particularly when the offender is released early. A convicted robber is a loose end. A character, by contrast, is manageable. A character can be laughed at, admired, scorned, romanticized, or pitted. A character can be contained inside a familiar narrative arc: rise, fall, punishment, disappearance. A character requires no institutional accounting. Pearl Hart was quickly converted into a character because the public could not comfortably hold her as a raw fact. A woman with a gun. A public holdup. A federal conviction. A sentence not completed as imposed. That sequence is morally awkward. Character smooths it. The press as an institution of discipline. Newspapers did not merely report Hart. They processed her. They emphasized certain details because those details performed cultural work: clothing, appearance, boldness, beauty, shamelessness, a strange woman, a sensational woman. The language varied, but the function was consistent, to make her legible as a type. The press also performed discipline by managing emotional permission. It told readers when to be outraged, when to be amused, when to be fascinated, when to be relieved. It framed the case as entertainment without admitting that it was doing so. This matters because the press can make harsh punishment feel necessary and then later make early release feel reasonable, simply by shifting tone. The law is blunt. The press is flexible. Together, they produce the public sense of what should happen. The Wild West show as a containment device. If a notorious offender enters performance, something significant occurs. The threat is neutralized by stagecraft. A Wild West show does not merely entertain. It reorganizes the frontier into a story the audience can enjoy. Violence becomes choreography. Crime becomes anecdote. Women become roles: saloon girl, frontier wife, tragic beauty, comic novelty. The entire messy reality of territorial life is packaged as nostalgia. When a woman like Hart is absorbed into such a setting, even briefly, it functions as cultural containment. She is no longer a policy problem. She is an attraction. Her crime becomes an act in a program. This solves several things at once. It turns public fascination into a controlled space. It removes the offender from local communities where her presence might provoke conflict. It changes the question from why was she released to what is she like. It relocates institutional retreat into the background. Performance offers an ending that law did not provide, not justice but closure. A ticketed closure. Commerce is the most effective form of forgetting. One of the strangest facts about notorious crime is how easily it becomes leisure. People who would not tolerate a neighbor like Hart will pay to hear about her. People who demand harsh punishment will still consume her story as thrill. This is not hypocrisy, it is a feature of modernity. The culture wants both moral certainty and excitement. It solves that tension by splitting the offender in two. The criminal, who must be condemned. The character, who can be enjoyed. Once the split is complete, people can consume the story without feeling implicated. This is why commercial retellings of crime often feel strangely clean. They preserve the shock but remove the institutional embarrassment. They keep the gun, the disguise, the coach, the chase. They downplay what cannot be enjoyed: the prison's awkwardness, the state's retreat, the questions of why punishment could not be sustained. Commerce forgets what does not sell. The marriage story and the respectability story. After release, many women with notorious pasts survive through the cover of ordinary life: marriage, household routine, reduced visibility, a new town where no one knows the name. It is tempting to treat such cover as redemption. It is more accurate to treat it as strategy. Marriage can function as a social shield. It provides a respectable framework that discourages inquiry. It gives the community a simple category for a woman: wife. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, wifehood could do what official certificates could not: it could make people stop looking. If Hart married after release, or remarried, or lived under other names, this would not be a moral twist. It would be an example of how women survive notoriety, by trading freedom of movement for the safety of belonging to a socially approved structure. That trade is one of the costs of female freedom in this era. A woman could live independently, but she could rarely live independently and notorious. The archive thins because the system is finished with her. There is a reason the post-release record becomes harder to pin down. Once the state stops controlling a body, it stops writing about that body. A prison file is thick because the prison needs to justify control. A parole file is thick because supervision needs documentation. A court file is thick because guilt must be proven. A private life, by contrast, is not an institutional object. It can pass without paper, especially for women living on the margins, especially if names change, especially if communities prefer not to know. This creates the conditions for folklore. Later writers, encountering thin records, begin to supply endings. The endings often say more about cultural need than about the person. The cultural need is always the same, to make the story complete. Why completion is not always truth. A crime story that ends in ordinary old age makes people uneasy. It feels like a mismatch. The public drama does not receive a dramatic conclusion. So the culture tends to push the ending into one of a few shapes. A repentant woman who found peace. A tragic woman who died young. A vanished woman who became legend. A punished woman who got what she deserved. But the most historically plausible ending for many women is the least narratively satisfying. A quiet life shaped by caution, often under different names, with ordinary relationships and ordinary decline. Quiet endings are not glamorous. They are real. Pearl Hart's story, stripped of romance, points toward that realism. The system wanted her quiet. The culture wanted her entertaining. The only way to satisfy both was to let entertainment happen briefly, and then let quiet take over. The real afterlife of the case. The most revealing afterlife is not where Hart went. It is what happened to the meaning of her case. Once the state released her early, the case was vulnerable. It could have become a public argument about punishment and gender. It could have created institutional scrutiny. It could have forced uncomfortable admissions. Instead, it drifted into a safer container, story. Story took the sharp institutional edge and turned it into folklore. The injustice system's retreat became a footnote. The gun became the center. This is a familiar pattern. Institutions retreat. Culture romanticizes. The public forgets the administrative truth. Hart becomes a legend, which is the final way a system can live with a disruptive woman, by allowing her to exist, but only as entertainment. What remains, and what we can responsibly claim. Because this book is committed to historical restraint, it matters to name the boundary clearly. We can follow the public record with confidence through robbery, capture, trial, conviction, imprisonment, and early release. After release, the record becomes uneven. Claims multiply. Certainty narrows. The responsible task is not to invent an ending that feels satisfying, but to describe the conditions under which a woman like Hart would most plausibly have survived: reduced visibility, strategic respectability, and the slow fading of a name into the margins of the archive. This is not a deficiency. It is part of the story. Pearl Hart does not only reveal the limits of punishment. She reveals the limits of documentation, and how those limits are exploited by culture to keep enjoying a case without confronting what the case actually exposed. The next chapter returns to the institutional heart of the matter, what Hart's case says about punishment as performance, about why the system needs offenders to look properly punished, and what happens when an offender's existence turns the punishment into a second scandal. Chapter 12. Punishment as performance. Punishment is often described as a response to harm. It is also a performance staged for an audience. This is not metaphor. It is function. A criminal justice system does not merely remove offenders from society. It reassures society that boundaries still exist and that authority can still be asserted. The court, the sentence, the prison, each step is designed to produce a particular feeling in the public, that disruption has been identified and contained. In Pearl Hart's case, the performance mattered as much as the law. Her robbery was not only theft, it was a public violation of category. And category violations demand visible correction. The system punished her not only to deter robbery, but to restore the social order she had made briefly uncertain. What the public wanted to see. In many crimes, the public is satisfied by an outcome. In crimes that become symbolic, the public wants a demonstration. A stagecoach robbery in 1899 carried the wrong kind of symbolism. It sounded like an older frontier, violent, porous, ungovernable, at the very moment the territory wanted to present itself as modern and consolidating. The robbery did not only frighten passengers. It embarrassed authority. Then the press added the element that made the embarrassment difficult to absorb. The offender was a woman. A woman holding up a coach disrupts two stories at once. The story that the frontier is being tamed. The story that women remain safely contained within feminine roles. The public's desire for punishment, therefore, was also a desire for repair. It wanted proof that the old frontier was not returning. It wanted proof that women who crossed the line could be corrected. The conviction and sentence were meant to supply that proof. Why prisons need offenders to look properly punished. A prison is a place where the state claims that pain has a purpose. Pain is supposed to produce humility. Hardness is supposed to produce obedience. Routine is supposed to erase individuality into order. The prison's legitimacy depends on the belief that the offender is being reshaped into something less threatening. This is why prisons are not only about custody. They are about moral messaging. To function smoothly, a prison relies on three kinds of disappearance. Disappearance from public view. Disappearance of the prisoner's narrative voice. Disappearance of the prisoner's symbolic power. Most prisoners disappear in all three ways. They become anonymous, routine-bound, and forgotten. Pearl Hart did not disappear cleanly. Her presence in custody remained symbolically active. Her case remained interesting. She remained legible in a way the institution could not fully dissolve. The prison could impose discomfort. It could not guarantee the meaning of that discomfort. And meaning is the real object of punishment. The danger of the offender who remains legible. A prison can tolerate many kinds of misconduct. What it struggles to tolerate is a prisoner who becomes a continuing public point of focus. This is not simply vanity on the part of officials. It is risk management. Public focus invites scrutiny of conditions, scrutiny of propriety, scrutiny of whether punishment is excessive, scrutiny of whether officials are competent, scrutiny of whether the institution itself is legitimate. A notorious woman inside a male-designed prison multiplies those risks. The prison's ordinary harshness begins to look like cruelty because the public imagines her body inside it. The prison's ordinary routines begin to look like special humiliation because she cannot be housed and managed without deviation. The system can punish a man harshly without inviting moral debate. It cannot always punish a woman harshly without being judged for the punishment. This is not kindness. It is cultural anxiety. Hart's legibility created the possibility of that judgment. And once judgment is invited, punishment stops being an unquestioned performance of authority. It becomes a contested act. Institutions do not like contested acts. The difference between retribution and theater. Retribution is supposed to be proportional. The offender did wrong, the offender suffers, the balance is restored. Theater is supposed to reassure. The audience watches, feels order return, and goes home calmer than it arrived. In everyday cases, retribution and theater overlap. In symbolic cases, theater tends to dominate. The system becomes preoccupied with how punishment appears, not only what punishment does. This helps explain why a severe sentence can be imposed and then softened quietly. The severe sentence satisfies the theater at the beginning. The public sees the system strike hard. The quiet softening reduces the ongoing risk of theater turning against the institution. Hart's case moved along that arc. At first, the system needed firmness. Later, it needed quiet. Why keeping her punished threatened the message. A sentence in a newspaper headline looks like certainty. A sentence carried out day after day can look like something else. With Hart inside Yuma, punishment did not simply continue, it accumulated meaning. Each month of confinement added to the sense that the state was choosing to keep a woman in an environment designed for men. The longer it went on, the more likely it was that the public story would shift from "she deserved it" to "what are we doing?" That shift is dangerous to legitimacy. It turns punishment into a debate about the state rather than about the offender. Hart's crime had been a challenge to authority. The state could not allow its response to become a second challenge, this time to its own decency. So the performance had to change. The early release as a performance adjustment. Early release is often interpreted as a new moral judgment about the offender. In a case like this, it is better understood as a performance adjustment, the institution altering its behaviour to protect the narrative that authority remains stable. The system did not overturn the conviction. It did not renounce punishment. It did not apologize. It simply stopped doing the part that risked making it look awkward. This is a key point. The system's retreat does not necessarily mean it changed its mind about Hart's guilt. It means it changed its mind about how long it could sustain the optics of her confinement. The sentence had done its initial work. It showed firmness. Prolonging it threatened to create a different story. Release reduced the chance of that story taking hold. What the public did with the gap. A performance is only successful if the audience accepts its meaning. Hart's early release created a gap in meaning. Why wasn't the sentence completed? What did it say about the crime? What did it say about the prison? The public filled that gap the way publics usually do, with narratives that restored comfort. Some narratives framed release as mercy. Some framed it as romance or novelty. Some framed it as a lucky escape. Almost all of them avoided the simplest institutional reading, that the system had punished her and then found the punishment difficult to sustain without damaging itself. The public prefers stories that protect faith in institutions. Even when it enjoys outlaw folklore, it rarely wants to confront that the outlaw's story sometimes exposes weakness at the center. So the gap was covered over, and the theater continued, just on a different stage. What this reveals about punishment generally. Pearl Hart's case is unusually clear because the crime was straightforward and the institutional response was visibly split, severity, then retreat. But the underlying mechanism is common. Punishment is always being negotiated between law and legitimacy, deterrence and decency, public appetite and institutional self-protection, the desire to appear firm and the need to avoid appearing cruel. When those forces align, punishment looks decisive and stable. When they conflict, punishment becomes improvisation under the cover of procedure. Hart forced the conflict into view. She did not do it by campaigning, writing manifestos, or attacking the system from outside. She did it by existing inside it in a way that made its design obvious. A male prisoner can be absorbed. A female prisoner can expose. And exposure is the one thing institutions consistently try to avoid. The lesson the system never states. No official document needs to say it for it to be true. The system can tolerate guilt. It can tolerate harshness. It can tolerate violence. What it struggles to tolerate is awkwardness. Awkwardness makes authority look like performance instead of inevitability. It makes punishment look like choice instead of natural consequence. It makes the institution visible as an institution, fallible, strategic, and constrained by social tolerance. Pearl Hart's case reveals that punishment is not only a matter of what the offender deserves. It is also a matter of what the state can bear to be seen doing. Chapter 13. The Men Around Her. Pearl Hart is often treated as though she moved through the story alone, an outlaw heroine, a novelty, a lone woman in men's clothes holding up a stagecoach. She did not. No one robs a male coach in a vacuum. Crimes of that kind require companionship, information, access to a firearm, confidence in timing, and some belief, whether naive or calculated, that escape is possible. Even when the act is small and the plan clumsy, it still happens inside a network of relationships. Hart's case also unfolded in a world where men controlled most formal power: policing, prosecution, sentencing, prison administration, newspapers, and the moral language used to interpret women's behavior. To write Hart as a solitary figure is to miss one of the central truths of her story. She did not simply confront law, she confronted a male-structured system. This chapter looks at the men around her, not to recenter them, but to clarify the social architecture within which her crime and punishment became meaningful. Joe Boot, the companion the record cannot avoid. Joe Boot is usually introduced as Hart's accomplice, sometimes as her lover, sometimes as her corruptor, sometimes as a footnote. The truth is that Boot's importance is structural. He is the male presence that allows society to explain Hart. A woman who commits armed robbery on her own terms is difficult to absorb. A woman who commits armed robbery under the influence of a man becomes legible. She can be framed as seduced, coerced, misled, or morally contaminated. These frames are not necessarily accurate. They are culturally convenient. Boot, therefore, served as narrative scaffolding. He made it easier for the public to place Hart back into a familiar script, a woman gone wrong because of a man. It is an old explanation, used repeatedly whenever women commit crimes that look too competent to be comfortably feminine. Whether Hart and Boot were romantically involved matters less, historically, than how their association was interpreted. The male accomplice allowed people to avoid confronting the simplest possibility, that Hart chose this act knowingly. In law, the association also had practical consequences. A mixed-gender criminal pair can be handled through a kind of moral sorting in which the man is treated as the dangerous agent and the woman as the moral puzzle. Courts and juries often punish both, but they do not always punish them with the same emotional logic. Boot could be treated as a straightforward criminal. Hart could not. This difference shapes how the case was told and remembered. The passengers and the driver, masculinity as the offended party. Stagecoach robbery is theater, but it is also humiliation. To stop a coach is to stop men on a road and tell them they must obey. The gun is not only a weapon, it is a claim to authority. It creates a temporary reversal. The robber becomes the law, and the passengers become subjects. In a gendered society, the humiliation is amplified if the robber is a woman. If a man is robbed by another man, it is a contest within a familiar hierarchy of violence. If a man is robbed by a woman, it threatens masculine pride in a different way. It implies that the man failed to protect himself, failed to protect others, failed to maintain the normal order in which women are protected rather than feared. This does not mean male victims deserved humiliation. It means the cultural reading of the humiliation mattered. Male victims, whether consciously or not, could feel additional pressure to insist on punishment, because punishment restores not only property but status. A legal case is made from testimony. Testimony is shaped by emotion. Hart's gender made the emotion heavier. The lawmen, the state as masculine force. The pursuit and capture of Hart and Boot is often treated as straightforward law enforcement. It was. It was also a performance of masculinity. Frontier policing relied on the idea of the competent male protector, the man who can ride, shoot, track, arrest, and impose order. The capture of stagecoach robbers reaffirmed that protector image. A female robber complicates the script. If she is captured easily, she can be framed as foolish and therefore harmless. If she proves difficult, she threatens the protector myth. Either way, the system has incentive to reassert male authority visibly. Arrest is a ritual. It places the offender's body under state control. When the offender is a woman who has publicly behaved like a man, the ritual becomes charged. It is not only restraint, it is correction. This is why the handling of Hart at arrest and trial becomes part of the story. The system is symbolically reclaiming territory, not only geographic territory but gender territory. The prosecutors, restoring order through language. Prosecutors do more than prove elements of a charge. They give the jury the story that makes punishment feel necessary. In Hart's case, the prosecution needed to avoid two dangers. That jurors might sympathize with a woman. That jurors might be fascinated by her and treat her as novelty rather than threat. To avoid sympathy, prosecutors could emphasize danger, the gun, the threat, the vulnerability of travelers, the sanctity of mail routes. To avoid novelty, they could emphasize seriousness. This was not theater, this was federal crime. They were also managing something harder to name, gendered disturbance. A woman committing a masculine crime can produce subconscious anxiety about social boundaries. Prosecutors could harness that anxiety by portraying her as abnormal, hardened, or morally contaminated, frames that justify harsh punishment. The prosecutor's role in such a case is therefore not only legal. It is cultural. It is to persuade the jury that the state's authority remains intact. Judges, the balancing act of severity and propriety. Judges sit at the intersection of law and public feeling. They must apply statutes and also maintain the courtroom's legitimacy. In symbolic cases, judges often perform a balancing act, assert authority without inflaming controversy. A judge sentencing Hart had to consider how punishment would be read. Too lenient, and the state appears weak. Too harsh, and the state risks appearing indecent toward a woman. This is the pattern that repeats in women's criminal cases. Women can be punished harshly in law, but the cultural appetite for seeing that harshness carried out is uneven. Judges often compensate by delivering severity on paper and relying on later discretion to soften the outcome if needed. This is not necessarily planned as a two-step strategy by any one person. It can emerge as an institutional habit. Courts perform firmness, and later institutions quietly manage discomfort. Hart's case looks like that habit in motion. Prison officials, practical men in a symbolic trap. Wardens and prison officials are often cast as brutal or humane, as though their personality is the main factor. In reality, they are trapped inside an institution with structural aims: security, routine, invisibility. A notorious woman in a male prison disrupts those aims. Officials must devise special arrangements, respond to scrutiny, control staff behavior and rumors, manage public curiosity, avoid scandal, maintain discipline without appearing indecent. This is not a moral dilemma in the abstract. It is a practical dilemma shaped by the fact that any misstep can become a public event. The safest administrative choice is the one that reduces exposure. This is how an official can appear merciful while acting primarily out of institutional self-preservation. Release becomes a way to end risk. The officials around Hart were not necessarily kinder than officials around male prisoners. They were simply operating under different constraints. The men who told her story. Perhaps the most significant men around Hart were not accomplices or officials. They were the ones who narrated her: reporters, editors, later writers, and men in the entertainment world. They decided what details mattered. They decided what tone to use. They decided whether she was a villain or a curiosity. This narrative control is itself a form of power. It shapes what survives, what becomes known, and what is forgotten. For women, the narrative tends to gravitate towards sex, romance, appearance, and morality. The legal and institutional mechanisms are flattened. The woman becomes a personality rather than a case study. This book resists that flattening. It treats Hart's story as institutional history, which requires us to see the men around her not as dramatic supporting characters, but as structural forces. The simplest institutional truth. Pearl Hart's case exposes a basic reality about women who commit masculine crimes. They are not only judged for the offense. They are judged for what their offense implies about men. A man robbed at gunpoint is a victim. A society robbed of its gender certainties becomes anxious. That anxiety intensifies punishment. It also intensifies the system's need to retreat when punishment begins to look awkward. The men around Hart, accomplice, victims, lawmen, prosecutors, judges, wardens, storytellers, formed the framework within which she could be made legible. Without that framework, she is too disruptive a figure to be comfortably held. With the framework, she can be classified: seduced, fallen, abnormal, comic, romantic. But classification is not truth. It is management. And the management of Pearl Hart, by men, by institutions, by narrative, reveals the real subject of this book. Not the thrill of a stagecoach robbery, but the uneasy labor of a system trying to make a woman's defiance mean something it can tolerate. Chapter 14. The Woman the System Wanted. The justice system does not punish in a cultural vacuum. It punishes inside a set of expectations about what the offender is supposed to be. In Pearl Hart's case, those expectations were not incidental. They were central. They shaped how she was described, how she was interpreted, what kinds of sympathy were permitted, and what kinds of punishment felt appropriate. They also shaped why the system could not comfortably sustain her imprisonment. This chapter is about that expectation, the woman the system wanted Hart to become, and what it meant that she did not become her. The acceptable female offender. A female offender is easiest to manage when she remains recognizable as feminine in the ways institutions understand femininity. Ashamed, dependent, fragile, repentant, explainable through male influence, willing to shrink into privacy. These are not moral virtues. They are institutional preferences. They make punishment feel coherent and socially safe. If a woman commits a crime and then performs these qualities, the system can absorb her. It can offer her as a lesson: she strayed, she suffered, she learned, order remains intact. The offender becomes proof that the system works. Pearl Hart threatened this proof because the crime itself had been performed in a way that read as masculine, armed, public, confrontational. But the deeper threat lay in what came after, the possibility that she might remain symbolically intact. A woman who commits a masculine crime and then remains unbroken is difficult for institutions to frame. Shame as a required performance. Shame is not only a private emotion. It is often demanded as a public performance, especially from women. In court, a contrite woman reassures the jury that the moral order is still operating. In prison, a humbled woman reassures officials that punishment is doing its work. In the public imagination, a shamed woman reassures society that female transgression is rare and correctable. When shame does not appear, or when it appears in an insufficiently theatrical form, the system begins to interpret the offender as harder and more dangerous than she may actually be. For men, emotional hardness can be framed as expected. For women, it can be framed as abnormal. This is part of why female offenders are so often pathologized. If the offender will not perform shame, she can be repositioned as mentally unwell. Illness becomes a substitute explanation for defiance. Hart was not successfully absorbed into that frame. Whatever her private emotions were, she did not settle into the role of the broken woman. Her very notoriety depended on the impression that she remained, in some sense, uncollapsed. This impression is precisely what made her such an institutional irritation. A woman who remains legible is a woman who remains a story. Dependence as a moral comfort. Another preferred female role is dependence. Society expects women to need men, economically, socially, physically. When a woman commits a crime, dependence provides an easy explanation. She was led, seduced, coerced, influenced. Even when she is convicted, dependence can soften the public's moral response. It allows people to pity her while still condemning the act. Pearl Hart's story could be told through dependence by attaching her to Joe Boot. That attachment did cultural work. It offered the public an explanation that preserved masculinity's centrality. Even when a woman is violent, a man must be behind it. But the dependence frame had limits because Hart's crime included visible choice. She did not merely travel with Boot. She participated in the hold-up. She wore men's clothing. She accepted the symbolic risks of public defiance. Dependence could not fully absorb that. This is the problem with women who act openly. They reveal that dependence is not total. Fragility versus threat. A system built on gendered expectations oscillates between treating women as fragile and treating them as threatening. Women are framed as fragile when the system wants to justify protection, pity, and special treatment. Women are framed as threatening when the system wants to justify harsh punishment. The same woman can be framed both ways in the same case, depending on which outcome is needed at the moment. Pearl Hart was threatened by this oscillation, and she also benefited from it. At sentencing, the system needed her to be threatening, a deterrent example. At imprisonment, the system began to need her to be fragile, a reason to soften and retreat without admitting retreat. This is how gender becomes an instrument inside punishment. It is not stable. It is used. Hart's case shows the switching logic clearly. First, she is dangerous enough to receive a severe sentence. Later, she is too inappropriate to keep in that punishment setting. The woman the system wanted could be constructed either way. The construction served institutional need. Repentance as a public settlement. Repentance is the emotional ending society prefers. A repentant offender makes everyone's life easier. The victim feels validated. The state feels justified. The public feels safe. The story closes. But repentance is not always available. Some offenders do not feel it. Some feel it privately and refuse to perform it publicly. Some learn that performing repentance invites exploitation and further humiliation. Some simply cannot afford the vulnerability. In Hart's case, the public record does not deliver a long, satisfying repentance arc. That absence is one reason later storytellers try to supply one. They need the story to settle. If she becomes repentant, then early release looks like mercy. If early release looks like mercy, the system looks humane. If the system looks humane, the institutional retreat disappears. Thus repentance becomes not only an emotional desire but an institutional convenience. The woman who disappears into domesticity. The final preferred role is disappearance into domesticity. A woman who marries, takes a new name, raises children, and avoids public life becomes socially manageable. Her criminal past becomes a private stain rather than a public challenge. Domesticity absorbs her. Even the idea that she might have become domestic helps society resolve discomfort. It tells a comforting story, that even a woman who robbed a stagecoach eventually returned to her proper place. This is why post-release narratives about marriage and children hold such power. They allow the public to imagine that the disruption was temporary and that gender order was ultimately restored. But domesticity is not only restoration. It is also concealment and survival. A woman with a notorious past may choose marriage not as moral surrender but as practical cover. Domesticity can be a shield from attention. Either way, it serves the same cultural function: it closes the story. What happens when the offender won't become the required woman? Pearl Hart's case suggests that she did not become the woman the system wanted quickly enough, visibly enough, or neatly enough. Her crime had already violated feminine expectations. Her notoriety kept her symbolically active. Her imprisonment made the prison visible. Her early release left the system exposed to questions about why it had not completed her sentence. This is the point at which the system tends to respond by changing the problem rather than solving it. It stops holding the offender and begins to rely on other mechanisms. Stigma, legend, reduced visibility, the social policing of women, the public's willingness to accept a comforting ending. If Hart moved into ordinary life, marriage, children, quiet labor, she became manageable. If she did not, the culture would still attempt to manage her through story. Either way, the system's desire was the same: not to keep punishing her, but to stop being forced to explain itself. The woman Hart actually was. The record does not give us a fully stable portrait of Pearl Hart's inner life. It gives us actions, institutional responses, and public framing. But even within those limitations, we can say this: she acted publicly. She crossed gender lines in conduct and appearance. She survived the legal process. She was not erased by the sentence. Whether she later sought domestic quiet or simply disappeared from record, she did not provide the system with the clean moral performance it prefers. This is why her case remains useful. It exposes how much punishment depends on the offender agreeing, explicitly or implicitly, to become the kind of woman the system can tolerate. Pearl Hart did not offer that agreement at the moment it was demanded. So the system found another ending. Not by finishing the sentence. By shifting the narrative away from itself. The next chapter turns to the final institutional maneuver: how the system lets time do its work, how distance, paperwork, and ordinary life slowly bury a case that once threatened to become a public argument about what punishment really means. Chapter 15: Time as a Sentence. Some punishments are imposed by courts. Others are imposed by time. A prison sentence is measured in years, but its effect is not confined to those years. It lingers in employment, housing, family, reputation, and the invisible calculus of whether a person is allowed to become ordinary again. For women in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, that calculus was particularly unforgiving. A woman's respectability could be destroyed quickly and restored only partially, if at all. Pearl Hart's case, after the robbery and the court and the prison, moves into this quieter domain: the slow punishment of memory, and the slow relief of being forgotten. This chapter is about that slow mechanism, how time becomes the system's final instrument, finishing what institutions could not finish openly. The justice system depends on forgetting. The justice system produces records, but it also depends on the public forgetting most cases. If every case remained vivid, the system would be overwhelmed by scrutiny. People would ask why some crimes are punished harshly and others softly, why some offenders are released early, why discretion operates unevenly, why prisons are built as they are. Forgetting allows institutions to continue functioning without constant justification. This is why time is such a powerful ally to authority. It dilutes outrage, softens curiosity, and turns unresolved questions into background noise. It does not answer the questions. It simply makes fewer people ask them. Pearl Hart's early release created a question the system did not want to answer: why was the sentence not completed? Time answered it in the easiest way possible, by letting it become old news. The offender as a diminishing object. The longer an offender remains visible, the longer the case remains a live problem. This is why institutions often favor endings that remove the offender from public view. Execution does it. Life imprisonment does it. Permanent asylum confinement does it. Exile does it. Early release does not. It returns the offender to the world as a moving object, potentially capable of reviving the case by existing. So if a system releases early, it relies on a secondary condition, that the offender will not keep the story alive. The offender may keep it alive by speaking publicly, repeating the crime, provoking scandal, refusing domestic quiet, becoming a symbol for others. Hart did not, in any sustained documented way, do these things. Her post-release existence does not appear as a continuing public disturbance. That absence is historically significant. It suggests that the system's gamble, release and quiet, worked. Not because Hart became morally good, but because she became administratively irrelevant. The archive as a clue to social outcome. After release, the record becomes thin. That thinness is not merely frustrating to historians, it is a clue. People whose lives remain institutionally entangled leave thick paper trails: arrests, court appearances, prison returns, psychiatric evaluations, welfare records, public scandal. When a person's record thins dramatically, it often means one of two things. She lived quietly enough to avoid institutional recapture, or she lived in conditions so marginal that the state did not record her unless forced. Both are forms of social invisibility. Neither is romantic. Both are plausible. In Hart's case, later summaries commonly describe a return to ordinary life structures: marriage, children, and eventual death as an older woman. Those details, when present, function as narrative closure. They reassure the public that the disruptive woman ultimately became manageable. Even if every detail cannot be confirmed to the last degree, the shape itself matters. The story ended not with spectacle but with ordinary time. Time did what the prison could not. It removed her from the present. How women vanish differently than men. A man with a notorious past can sometimes remain visible without immediate social annihilation. He may be tolerated as a rough character, a reformed scoundrel, a man who had his troubles. A woman is less likely to be granted that tolerance. Her notoriety is often sexualized, moralist, and treated as contagious. Communities fear her as an influence. Men seek her as a story. Other women fear association. Institutions treat her as unstable. So a woman with a notorious past often survives by shrinking her public surface area, moving away, changing her name, limiting conversation, marrying into a protective framework, choosing anonymity over autonomy. These are not cinematic choices. They are strategies dictated by a society that punishes women socially long after formal punishment ends. If Hart married and took a new name, it would not simply be domestic redemption. It would be social camouflage. Time rewards camouflage. Closure as a cultural service, not a truth. The public likes closure. It does not like open endings. When a case does not provide closure through completed punishment, the culture will supply closure through narrative. This is how Hart's case drifted into folklore and then into a kind of tidy historical anecdote: the woman bandit, the prison, the early release, and then the quiet fade. But closure is not necessarily truth. It is an emotional settlement. It allows society to stop thinking about what the case revealed. Hart's case revealed that punishment has limits, and that those limits are shaped by gender and optics. Closure allows society to treat the case as entertainment rather than as evidence. Time assists in this process by changing the meaning of the case. What was once embarrassing becomes quaint. What was once disturbing becomes curious. What was once a policy problem becomes a story told at a distance. Distance is the public's favorite kind of safety. The institutional benefit of a quiet ending. A quiet ending benefits the system more than a dramatic one. A dramatic ending invites interpretation, martyrdom, injustice, scandal, outrage. It keeps the case alive. It makes institutions accountable in the public imagination. A quiet ending does the opposite. It lets the system's inconsistencies dissolve. If Hart died in old age, away from the spotlight, the system gained the final kind of closure it prefers: biological closure. A dead offender cannot revive the story. This is not sinister, it is structural. Institutions rely on the fact that people age, move, and die. Time resolves what policy cannot. What is lost when time finishes the sentence? When time finishes the sentence, certain truths disappear with it. The administrative discomfort that produced early release. The precise reasoning used by officials. The lived experience of imprisonment in a male prison. The daily negotiations of survival after notoriety. The reality of what it meant to become quiet. These truths are difficult to recover because they were not preserved as important by the institutions that produced the record. The archive preserves what the system needed to justify control. It does not preserve what would later reveal the system's weaknesses. This is one reason the legend grows. Legend is not bound by missing paperwork. It can supply whatever the record lacks. It can provide neatness where life was messy. Historical writing has to resist that neatness, even when it makes the story less satisfying. The sentence that did not end in court. Pearl Hart's legal sentence was finite. Her social sentence was not. Her case demonstrates how punishment can continue through distrust, stigma, vulnerability, the narrowing of options, the constant need for discretion in ordinary life. And it also demonstrates how punishment can dissolve not through forgiveness, but through time's gradual erasure. The system could not finish her prison sentence cleanly, so it allowed time to finish the work. This is what happens when institutions retreat. They do not always resolve the moral problem. They allow the public to forget it. The quiet truth at the end of the story. If Hart lived long enough to die as an older woman, her life contained more years outside prison than inside it. That fact is uncomfortable for those who want punishment to feel absolute. It suggests that even serious crime can be absorbed back into ordinary time. But this does not mean the crime did not matter. It means punishment did not own her entire life. There is a difference. The state punished her for what she did on the road to Globe. The state could not sustain the punishment without damaging itself. It retreated. Hart re-entered the world under the pressure of stigma and notoriety. Then gradually, time performed what the system prefers. It made the case less urgent. In the end, the story becomes a historical episode, and the woman becomes a name. That is time as sentence, not a judgment, but a slow reduction. The next chapter turns toward what remains once time has done its work, how cases like Hart's are inherited, taught, and marketed, what is emphasized and what is erased, and why the institutional truth retreat must be retrieved deliberately, because it will not survive on its own. Chapter 16, What Remains. A Stagecoach Robbery is easy to remember. It contains drama built into the act, a road, a weapon, a sudden reversal of control. It can be retold in a paragraph, dramatized in a film scene, reshaped into a tourist anecdote. What is harder to remember is what Pearl Hart's case actually reveals. It reveals that punishment is not only a legal function. It is a social performance with limits. It reveals that those limits are unevenly applied and often disguised. It reveals that institutions retreat when a case threatens to make authority look awkward, especially when the offender is a woman who has violated masculine-coded boundaries of violence and public defiance. This chapter gathers what remains once the legend is stripped back and the institutional trail is followed as far as the surviving record allows. What we can say with confidence, and what we cannot. A responsible historical account is not the same as a complete one. Some cases are thick with documentation from beginning to end, court transcripts, prison records, correspondence, photographs, clear timelines, stable identities. Others thin abruptly, leaving only fragments after the moment the state's interest fades. Pearl Hart's case is thick where the system held her: robbery, arrest, trial, imprisonment, and early release. It becomes thinner afterwards, which is typical for a woman whose later life moved outside institutional capture. That thinning is not a flaw in the story, it is part of the story. It shows where power was applied and where it withdrew. The obligation of this book is not to manufacture a perfectly neat ending, but to maintain fidelity to what can be supported and to explain what the gaps mean. Gaps are not empty. They show what the system did not consider worth preserving. The crime as a symptom, not a spectacle. Pearl Hart's robbery was not an inevitability, and it was not a carnival act. It was a decision made within a particular world, a world of uncertain work, social marginality, and gendered constraint. Women did not have equal access to resources or safety. They also did not have equal access to moral forgiveness when they broke the rules. Hart's decision to take by force, rather than by petty theft, domestic dependence, or quiet desperation, placed her in direct conflict with institutions. That choice is part of what makes her distinct. Yet the robbery itself is not the most instructive element. Its most instructive function is what it triggered, a system response shaped as much by embarrassment and category anxiety as by the offense. The justice system's first instinct, firmness. The state's first move was clear: convict and sentence. Federal law provided a pathway to severity because mail robbery carried symbolic weight. In territorial context, the mail was not simply mail, it was proof of national reach. The system needed to show that it could protect its routes, punish those who challenged them, and reassure the public that order was consolidating. Thus Hart was punished decisively at the front end. That firmness was the public performance of authority. The justice system's second instinct, retreat. The second move was quieter, reduce the cost of continuing the performance. A notorious woman inside a male prison created administrative difficulty and reputational risk. Her confinement remained visible. The prison became part of the story. The punishment began to invite judgment. The system adjusted. It did so through discretion rather than confession, framing the shift in language that avoided accountability. The effect was not abolition of punishment, but the ending of an awkward punishment. Hart's early release is therefore not a sentimental subplot. It is the institutional center of the case. The social system's third move, legend. Once the state released Hart, culture took over. Legend offered the closure that law could not provide. It replaced institutional questions with personality. It turned retreat into romance and containment into entertainment. It allowed the public to keep the thrill while losing the discomfort. The legend did not need to be designed by any one person to be functional. It simply needed to drift toward the narratives a society is most willing to repeat. A woman cannot remain in public memory as a raw category violation. She must become either a warning or a novelty. Hart became both. The fourth move, time. Finally, time did what institutions prefer. It softened the case into distance. Time reduced scrutiny. It dulled the memory of the release's awkwardness. It allowed the case to be inherited as a frontier anecdote rather than as evidence of a system's limits. This is why Hart's case, despite its popularity, is often misunderstood. The best-known parts of the story are the least institutionally important: the disguise, the gun, the hold-up. The most important part, the system's inability to sustain the sentence, tends to be pushed to the margins. What the case teaches, if it is treated seriously. Pearl Hart's story teaches several things at once. Punishment is constrained by social tolerance. The law may be clear, the execution of punishment must still be borne by institutions operating in a cultural world. Gender changes the meaning of identical acts. The robbery mattered. But the gender disturbance created by a woman committing a masculine-coded offense multiplied the symbolic stakes. Discretion is not peripheral, it is central. The system's most meaningful decisions often happen outside the courtroom, under the cover of practicality. Legend is a form of control. It contains what institutions cannot comfortably explain by turning it into entertainment. The archive is shaped by power. The record is thick where the state controlled her and thin where it did not. That pattern is itself a historical fact. These are not moral conclusions about Hart's goodness or badness. They are structural conclusions about how systems behave. The quiet truth about her later life. You asked for more about her life after release: marriage, children, how she ended her life. That material matters, and it belongs in this book, not as trivia, but because it completes the institutional story. A woman who survives notoriety into old age does not simply get away with it. She lives under the long shadow of a case the public still thinks it owns. She survives by shrinking her visibility and trading freedom of self-definition for safety. At some point in this book, either in a dedicated chapter on the quiet years or in a concluding section, we will lay out, carefully and without embellishment, what can be supported about marriages and name changes, what can be supported about children, what can be supported about where she lived, what can be supported about her death and burial, and we will be honest about where the record is thin and why that thinness exists. This approach honors your commitment to historical true crime, fact-based, non-speculative, clear-eyed. What remains, in the end? Pearl Hart remains because she exposes an institutional weakness that many cases conceal. The system could convict her. It could punish her. It could not bear to keep punishing her without making itself look unstable. That is why her story still matters. Not because the robbery was the biggest or the bloodiest. Not because she fits a romantic outlaw mold, but because she shows the point at which punishment stops being about the offender and becomes about the institution's capacity to tolerate its own choices. And when an institution cannot tolerate the meaning of what it is doing, it does not announce defeat. It simply shifts the story elsewhere, into discretion, into legend, into time. What remains, then, is not only Pearl Hart. It is the outline of the system that tried to contain her, and the quiet admission, written into its actions, that containment has limits. Chapter 17, The Quiet Years. If you want the most honest ending to Pearl Hart's story, you have to accept something the legend resists. It does not end with a gun. It ends with paperwork, name changes, domestic arrangements, and the long ordinary work of not becoming visible again. The public prefers an outlaw ending because it feels proportionate to the act. But most lives, even notorious ones, do not end proportionately. They end gradually, in the way bodies do when they are allowed to keep living. Hart was allowed to keep living. That fact alone unsettles the appetite for moral symmetry. It raises a question the public never stops asking, even when it pretends to move on: what did she do with the rest of her life? The answer is not a single clear narrative. It is a sequence of partial truths, unevenly recorded, because the state stopped caring once she stopped being administratively useful, and because Hart had every incentive to become difficult to find. The first problem after release: visibility. Release did not give Hart privacy. It gave her exposure. A notorious woman walking back into the world carries a kind of attention that is not stable. It can flare in unexpected places. A name can travel ahead of her. Men can approach her because they want proximity to a story. Women can reject her because they fear association. Employers can refuse her because respectability is fragile and easily contaminated. Hart's freedom depended, in practical terms, on reducing that attention. There are only so many ways to do that in this era. Move frequently. Change names. Attach oneself to a respectable structure. Limit public speech. Accept smaller, quieter work. Avoid repeating the kind of visibility that made the original case famous. For men, notoriety can sometimes be worn like a badge. For women, it is more often worn like a target. So the first task of post-prison life is not reinvention in the romantic sense. It is concealment. The brief period where notoriety could be cashed in. There is evidence, repeated often enough to be taken seriously, that Hart tried, at least briefly, to turn the public fascination into income by appearing in a Wild West show or similar entertainment setting. This is not a triumph story. It is a containment story. A show gives notoriety boundaries. It makes the audience's desire manageable. You buy a ticket, you stare, you go home. It also allows the wider culture to reframe a disruptive offender as part of the act, which reduces the risk that she becomes a live political problem. If Hart did step into performance, it was likely less about celebrating her crime and more about surviving the immediate aftermath of fame. Fame creates costs. Performance is one way to pay them. But performance also has limits, especially for a woman. Once the novelty fades, the market moves on. If Hart wanted to remain free, she would have needed something steadier than spectatorship. So the story turns, as it does for many notorious women, toward quiet life structures. Names, marriages, and the usefulness of domestic cover. The record associates Hart with more than one marriage across her lifetime. Even if every detail cannot be perfectly pinned down, the pattern is consistent with what women in her position often did. They moved under names that offered cover and continuity. One name follows her early: Frank Hart, commonly described as her first husband. That marriage is often treated as a prologue in retellings, a quick explanation for why she ended up on the road. It may have been more than that. For a woman, marriage is not only romance. It is legal identity, mobility, and social shelter. Later accounts commonly report another marriage, to a man named George Calvin Cal Bywater. Whether one reads this as love, strategy, or a mixture of both, the structural function is clear. Marriage is a way to become ordinary in a society that prefers women to be ordinary. It allows a woman to re-enter social space as someone's wife rather than as a notorious offender. That does not erase the past. It softens it. Domestic cover has a particular value for women with criminal notoriety because it discourages public inquiry. A married woman is less available to strangers, less available to reporters, less available to the kind of male curiosity that can quickly turn dangerous. Marriage can be a cage. It can also be armor. Children and the non-romantic consequence of time. The record also associates Hart with children. Two names appear frequently in later summaries: Joe and Emma. It is important not to treat this as sentimental closure. Motherhood does not cleanse a crime. It does not prove repentance. It simply means a woman continued living long enough for life to unfold in ways that are not cinematic. And for a notorious woman, children can function as both burden and anchor. They intensify the need for stability. They also intensify vulnerability. A woman with a criminal past cannot afford constant attention if she is trying to keep a household intact. She cannot afford constant movement. She cannot afford conflict with authorities. She must keep the story quiet because the cost is no longer only hers. Children also complicate the public appetite for punishment. It is easier to imagine a criminal as an unchanging villain than as a parent buying food, finding housing, navigating illness, and aging. This is why the legend tends to either erase children or use them as proof of redemption. Both moves are convenient. Neither is necessary for a historical account. Children mean what they mean in most lives, the continuation of time. The long fade, not absolution, but survival. Hart's later life is not remembered because it was dramatic. It is remembered because the earlier life was, and people cannot accept that the earlier life did not determine the ending. But most systems of punishment are not total. They do not own every remaining year. They do not control what happens after release unless the offender is drawn back into courtrooms and prisons. Hart does not appear, in the accessible public record, as a continuing violent offender. She does not become a repeating institutional problem. Instead, she fades. Fading is not the same as innocence. Fading is a social outcome. A person who was once too visible learns to become less so, because remaining visible carries costs that never stop accumulating. This is where the true punishment of notoriety lives, not in the year of the crime, but in the decades afterward, in the constant need to manage what people think they know. How she ended, the least dramatic ending, the most instructive one. Pearl Hart is generally recorded as living into old age and dying in 1955 in Arizona. That is the simplest ending available. It is also the most disturbing to the moral imagination, because it refuses the tidy accounting people crave. No final showdown. No poetic justice. No last-minute confession that restores certainty. Just the ordinary fact of a woman who did something violent and public and then kept living. This ending matters because it completes the institutional story. The system punished her. The system retreated. And then the system relied on time to finish what it could not finish openly, to reduce her into a historical name rather than a live discomfort. That is what time does best. It does not judge. It dissolves. The real conclusion of the Pearl Hart case. If you want the truest final image, it is not the stagecoach. It is the afterlife, a woman moving through years under the pressure of an infamous past, using whatever ordinary structures she could to survive: marriage, name, household, quiet. The public wants an outlaw. The archive gives a life. And a life, once extended beyond the crime, becomes difficult for institutions and audiences alike. It forces a recognition that punishment is not always a clean moral ending. Sometimes it is a performance that the system abandons when the performance becomes costly, leaving the rest to be handled by stigma, silence, and time. Pearl Hart did not just test the system on the road to Globe. She tested it afterward, by continuing to exist. That is why her story belongs in this series. Not because she was a romantic outlaw, but because she exposes the limit of what punishment can reliably do. It can convict, confine, and threaten. It cannot control what a woman becomes once the gate opens, except by hoping she will learn what the system itself learned in her case. Quiet is safer. Chapter 18. The Limits of Justice. Every criminal case tests a system. Most tests are routine. A few expose fault lines. Pearl Hart's case belongs to the second category. Not because of the amount stolen, not because of violence committed, and not because of legal novelty, but because it forced the justice system to confront something it is structurally uneasy with: a woman who committed a masculine-coded crime, survived punishment, and did not collapse into the moral shape the system prefers. This final chapter does not resolve the story in the way legend wants. It resolves it in the way history demands, by naming the limit that was reached and explaining why it mattered. Justice as an aspiration, not a constant. Justice systems present themselves as stable machines. Lawbooks reinforce this impression: statutes, procedures, precedents, hierarchies. Everything appears orderly. But justice is not a constant state. It is an aspiration negotiated through institutions run by people, shaped by culture, and constrained by public tolerance. What is possible in theory is not always sustainable in practice. Pearl Hart's sentence was legally sound. Her continued imprisonment was institutionally unstable. That distinction matters. The system did not fail to identify guilt. It failed to carry the meaning of its own punishment without exposing itself to scrutiny it did not want to endure. This is not hypocrisy. It is how power actually works. What the system could do, and what it could not. The system could arrest her, charge her, convict her, sentence her, imprison her. These acts asserted authority. The system could not keep her imprisoned without attracting discomfort, neutralize her symbolic charge, prevent her existence from becoming commentary, complete the punishment without risking its own legitimacy. This is the limit of justice revealed by the case. Not a legal limit, but a cultural one. The law can authorize punishment. Institutions must still live with what that punishment looks like. Why gender mattered more than doctrine. If Pearl Hart had been a man, this book would be shorter. The robbery would still have been a crime. The conviction would still have mattered. But the institutional consequences would have been different. A male offender would not have turned the prison into a question of propriety. A male offender would not have been so easily converted into a moral embarrassment. A male offender's punishment would not have risked being read as indecent. Gender did not excuse Hart. Gender complicated the system's response to her. That complication produced the retreat. This is why the case remains instructive. It shows that equality before the law is constrained by inequality in meaning. The same act does not carry the same symbolic weight when committed by different bodies. Justice is applied to acts. Punishment is applied to people. People come with cultural baggage. The myth of getting away with it. One of the laziest readings of Hart's case is that she got away with it. She did not. She was arrested, tried, convicted, imprisoned, and marked for life. She lived under stigma. She survived through quietness. She likely paid costs that never appear in court records, narrowed options, controlled visibility, and the constant management of a past she could not fully escape. Early release is not the same as escape. Living long enough to become ordinary is not the same as winning. What Hart got away with was forcing the system to stop before it was comfortable stopping. That is not triumph. It is exposure. The real legacy of the case. Pearl Hart did not change the law. She did not inspire reform. She did not become a movement. Her legacy is subtler and more uncomfortable. She demonstrated that punishment depends on performance. She demonstrated that discretion is the system's pressure valve. She demonstrated that legend can replace accountability. She demonstrated that time is often used to finish what institutions cannot. And she demonstrated that a woman who refuses to disappear neatly can make the system itself look uncertain. That uncertainty is what this book preserves. Why this story matters now. Historical true crime often trades in extremes, monsters and saints, brutality and redemption. This story resists those shapes. Pearl Hart was neither a monster nor a heroine. She was a woman who acted, a system that reacted, and an outcome shaped by fear of embarrassment more than by moral clarity. That pattern did not end with the frontier. Modern justice systems still rely on discretion to manage discomfort, struggle with gendered offenders, retreat quietly when punishment becomes politically awkward, allow culture to turn cases into stories instead of lessons. This is why writing this history carefully matters. It keeps the focus where the system would prefer it not to be, on its own behavior. A quiet ending, deliberately kept quiet. This book ends without spectacle because the truth does not offer one. Pearl Hart did not die at the gallows. She did not die young. She did not remain infamous forever. She lived, aged, and died in relative quiet. That quiet is not an accident. It is the final form of containment. The system could not bear to keep her. The culture could not bear to keep questioning why. So time closed the case. This book reopens it, not to sensationalize a robbery, but to mark the place where justice reached its limit and chose retreat over endurance. That limit is not unique to Pearl Hart. She simply made it visible. Bibliographic note and method. A book like this lives or dies on restraint. The temptation in historical true crime is always the same. When the archive thins, the prose swells. Motive is invented. Inner lives are guessed. Dialogue is reconstructed. A neat ending is manufactured because readers are trained to expect one. This book refuses that. Pearl Hart's story is vivid enough without invention. Where the record is strong, it is followed closely. Where the record is thin, the thinness is treated as part of the history rather than as a gap to be filled with imagination. This chapter explains how the work has been built, what kinds of sources have been relied upon, what kinds have been treated cautiously, and how the uncertain parts of Hart's post-release life should be understood. The problem of a famous woman and a thin archive. Pearl Hart is widely cited and frequently retold, which creates an illusion of documentary abundance. In reality, much of what circulates about her is repetition, later accounts borrowing from earlier accounts, smoothing rough edges, and turning speculation into fact through sheer frequency. This is especially true of claims about her motives, the precise nature of her relationship with Joe Boot, pregnancy as the decisive reason for release, her movements after prison, the exact details of marriages and children, the emotional tone of her private life. Some of these claims may be true. Some are almost certainly distorted. The difficulty is that the public story is so well loved that it often drowns out the administrative record. A responsible approach, therefore, begins by separating two things: the case as it appears in contemporary documentation, the case as it appears in later legend and popular summaries. This book treats the first as evidence and the second as artifact. Primary sources: what anchors the narrative. Where possible, the most valuable materials for Hart's case are contemporary newspapers. These provide immediacy, how the crime and trial were framed at the time, what details were emphasized, and how gender was mobilized in public description. They must be read with caution, newspapers sensationalized, but they are indispensable for reconstructing public reaction and tone. Court and legal references. Because the offense involved U.S. mail, legal handling is central. Court summaries and legal reporting help anchor charges, convictions, and sentencing. Prison and territorial documentation. Records related to Yuma Territorial Prison, its conditions, policies, and demographic realities help interpret why Hart's confinement was administratively awkward and why discretion functioned as a relief valve. Geographic and institutional context. Maps, postal route histories, territorial governance material, and the history of the Arizona criminal justice system provide the institutional setting that popular retellings often ignore. These sources do not always provide a tidy narrative. They provide what history most often provides: jagged fragments that have to be handled without forcing them into a smooth arc. Secondary sources: useful, but not sovereign. Secondary sources: later histories, biographies, museum texts, academic work, and reputable long-form journalism, are valuable for synthesis and for locating primary material, but they must not be treated as self-validating. In Hart's case, reputable long-form journalism has been particularly helpful in tracing how the legend formed and which details remain uncertain. But secondary sources can also become pipelines for error when they repeat one another without returning to original documentation. Popular platforms often do this, and the repetition is then mistaken for confirmation. Where the same detail appears widely but lacks clear primary support, this book treats it as contested or provisional rather than definitive. On the post-release life, what can be said and how it is handled. Hart's life after release, marriage, children, and death. That material is included in this book because it matters. It closes the institutional story and resists the romance of a dramatic outlaw ending. However, it must be handled with the same discipline as the rest of the narrative. The methodological rule used here is simple. If a biographical detail can be supported by more than one reliable reference and aligns with official record patterns, it is treated as likely. If it appears only in repeated popular retellings without clear provenance, it is treated as uncertain. If it contradicts other claims, the contradiction is named rather than resolved through guesswork. This approach is not cautious for its own sake. It is necessary because women like Hart often moved through name changes and social camouflage, and because institutions recorded them unevenly. The archive is shaped by power, and women's lives frequently fall into its blind spots once they cease to be objects of institutional control. That blind spot is part of what this book demonstrates. On language and anachronism. Contemporary reporting about Hart often uses language that reflects the prejudices of its time. Where such language is historically significant, because it demonstrates how women were framed, its meaning is represented without adopting the cruelty of the original phrasing. The goal is to show how the system spoke about her without reproducing harm as style. Similarly, modern labels are used carefully. Terms like feminist, icon, or empowerment are avoided as explanatory shortcuts. They collapse the historical specificity of the case into present-day sentiment. This book is concerned with what the institutions did and why, not with retroactive branding. What this method produces. This method produces a particular kind of true crime book. Less interested in twists. More interested in systems. Less interested in psychological certainty. More interested in institutional behavior. Less interested in myth. More interested in what the record will actually bear. Pearl Hart's case can carry that weight because the case is not, at its core, about mystery. It is about limits. The law could name her crime. The court could sentence her. The prison could not bear to keep her. The archive makes that clear, even when it refuses to provide a perfectly smooth biography afterwards.